The oldest memory Eliza Ashcroft had of her mother was the smell of wood smoke and dried lavender, the way it clung to the woman's shawl even on the coldest mornings, even when there was nothing left to burn, and the lavender was long gone from any garden they'd passed. By the time Catherine Ashcroft drew her last breath in the back of a borrowed wagon outside a town whose name none of them could pronounce, that smell had faded too. What was left was just the weight of 5 children staring at a body that didn't move, and a 13-year-old girl who understood with horrible clarity that there was no one else coming. She did not cry. Not then. She sent the 2 middle boys, Thomas, 11, and Jacob, 9, to dig a shallow grave in the frozen earth at the edge of a pine stand while she wrapped her mother in the quilt they'd carried from Missouri. Her sister Clara, 7, sat in the wagon bed holding their youngest brother Owen's hand. Owen was 5. He hadn't spoken in 3 days, not since he'd climbed up next to his mother and realized she wasn't sleeping. The burial took longer than it should have. The ground was hard and the boys' hands blistered before the hole was 2 feet deep. But Eliza didn't stop them, and she didn't help. She stood at the wagon's edge with Owen against her hip and watched the mountains in the west go purple in the failing light. And she made a promise to a woman who could no longer hear her. "We will stay together, all of us, whatever it takes." She didn't know, standing there in that cold Montana dusk, exactly what it would take. She would learn. That was 4 days ago. Since then, they had traveled west along a rutted track that the man who'd lent them the wagon called a road. He'd given them until the 5th day to return it, which meant they had 1 day left and approximately nothing to show for it. The town of Harlan's Crossing, which he'd assured them had a land office and a church and people willing to help a widow with children, had turned out to be a collection of 8 buildings, 2 of which were boarded shut. The land office was closed. The people who might have been willing to help were either gone for the season or simply unwilling. The first door they'd knocked on, a woman in a yellow apron had looked at the 5 of them on her porch and said, without any particular cruelty, "We can't take in strays." She said it the way she might have said it about a dog. Then she closed the door. The second door, a man who ran what appeared to be a dry goods store from his front room, had offered Eliza 30 cents for the quilt still folded in the wagon bed. She'd told him no. He'd told her to keep moving. By the 3rd day out of Harlan's Crossing, heading west because west was the only direction they hadn't tried, the food was gone. Not low. Gone. Thomas had found some dried service berries on a bush along the track, and they'd eaten those, and Jacob had managed to catch a rabbit in a snare he'd fashioned from a piece of wire, which had given them 1 small meal shared between 5 people. Owen ate his portion without looking at anyone. Clara had cried quietly while she chewed, trying not to let the others see. Eliza had eaten last, and less than her share, and told herself she wasn't hungry. She was very hungry. The ranch appeared on the afternoon of the 4th day like something she might have imagined. A low, square house with a stone chimney, a barn that was weathered gray but still standing, a fence line that stretched east toward a creek she could hear but not see. There were cattle. Not many, maybe a dozen visible from the track, but they were real cattle, solid and alive, their breath coming in small clouds in the November cold. "Is that a house?" Clara asked from beside her on the wagon bench. "It's a ranch," Thomas said from the wagon bed, where he'd been lying with his eyes closed for the better part of an hour. "Same thing," Clara said. "It's not the same thing," Thomas said, though he didn't explain the difference. Eliza pulled the horse to a stop and looked at the place for a long moment. There was smoke coming from the chimney. That meant someone was there. The question was whether that someone would be better or worse than the woman in the yellow apron, and there was genuinely no way to know. "Stay here," she told the others. "Eliza," Thomas started. "Stay here until I know it's safe." She climbed down from the bench, straightened what was left of her coat, a woman's coat she'd been growing into for 2 years and still hadn't quite reached, and walked toward the house. She was halfway across the yard when the door opened. The man who came out was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. He was tall, wide through the shoulders, somewhere past 40, with gray coming heavy in the dark hair under his hat. He moved like someone who'd been doing physical work his whole life, and had the kind of tired that doesn't come from a single long day, but from years of them stacked up. In his right hand he carried a rifle, not raised, but not at his side either. held at a diagonal, the way a man holds a rifle when he wants you to see it, but doesn't want you to think he's threatening you with it. He stopped at the edge of the porch and looked at her. She stopped in the middle of the yard and looked at him. "I don't want trouble," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Neither do I," he said, "which is why I'm going to ask you to turn that wagon around and head back the way you came. We've got nowhere to go back to." "That's not my concern." She held his gaze. He had dark eyes, deep set, and the look in them was not cruel exactly. It was something older than cruelty, something worn down to a flat, hard surface. "My mother died 4 days ago," she said. "I've got 4 younger brothers and sisters in that wagon. We haven't eaten properly in 2 days. I'm not asking you to take us in. I'm asking if you'll sell us some food. I'm not running a store. I can work for it. We all can. I don't need workers. Then I'll give you what money I have left, which isn't much, and we'll be gone by morning." He studied her for a moment. Then he looked past her toward the wagon, where she knew perfectly well all 4 of her siblings had climbed out and were standing in a row watching the exchange. She hadn't told them to do that. She would have told them not to, if she'd had a moment to think about it. "How old are you?" he said. 13. Something moved across his face. It wasn't pity, exactly. Or if it was the kind of pity a person tries hard not to feel, because feeling it means having to do something about it. 13, he repeated. "Yes, sir." He looked at the children again. Then he looked back at her, and she watched him make a decision she could not read, watched his jaw tighten, and his hand shift on the rifle and his eyes go somewhere else for just a second, somewhere inside himself. "Get them out of the cold," he said finally. "I'll figure out what I've got." His name was Silas Boone, and he had not had people in his house in a very long time. This was evident in the state of the kitchen. Not dirty exactly, but stripped down, functional in the way a working man's space gets when no one's around to put things anywhere that isn't immediately practical. A single cup on the table, 2 plates on a shelf, though only one was ever used, a pot that had been scrubbed clean and hung by the fire, which suggested habits if nothing else. He moved around the kitchen with a stiff economy of motion, not looking at the children, pulling things out of a larder that was better stocked than Eliza had dared hope. A smoked haunch of venison, dried beans, cornmeal, a jar of preserved tomatoes. He didn't offer to let them help. He didn't make conversation. He just cooked, with the focused silence of a man who eats alone and always has. The children sat at his table without being told to. Owen crawled onto the bench next to Clara and put his head on her shoulder. Thomas watched Silas cook with the calculating attention of a boy trying to figure out whether to trust someone. Jacob had spotted the dog, an old hound lying near the fire, gray around the muzzle, and was watching it with the kind of longing that didn't need any words. "What's his name?" Jacob asked. Silas didn't turn around. "What?" "The dog." A pause. "Biscuit." Jacob's mouth curved. "That's a funny name for a dog." "He came with it." "What do you mean he came with it?" "I mean someone else named him." Silas set a cast-iron pan on the fire with a clang that closed the subject. Eliza watched all of this from her seat at the end of the bench, cataloging what she could see. The rifle now leaned against the wall by the door, close but not in hand. The set of his shoulders, the fact that he was cooking at all. She was trying to figure out what kind of man this was, and she didn't have enough information yet. Owen slid off the bench and walked across the room to where Biscuit lay by the fire. No one told him to stop. Silas heard the movement, glanced back, said nothing. Owen sat down cross-legged beside the dog, not touching him, just sitting. After a moment, Biscuit raised his heavy head, examined the boy with enormous dark eyes, and set his head back down, this time on Owen's knee. It was the first time in 4 days that Owen had moved toward anything. Tot. The meal when it came was simple, venison and beans with cornbread cooked in the cast iron. It wasn't a feast. But it was hot, and there was enough of it, and when Clara cleaned her bowl in about 3 minutes flat and looked up with the expression of someone trying to decide if it was acceptable to say anything, Silas picked up the pot and wordlessly refilled her bowl without her having to ask. Clara looked at him like he'd just performed some kind of small miracle. "Thank you," she said. He sat back down. "Don't thank me." "Mama always said you should thank people when they—" "Clara," Eliza said quietly. Clara subsided. The table was quiet for a while, just the sound of eating and the fire and the occasional shift of Biscuit settling himself more comfortably against Owen's leg. Thomas put his spoon down. He had the look he got when he was about to say something that Eliza would have preferred he didn't say, which was a look she'd come to recognize and never quite managed to head off in time. "Are you going to let us stay?" he asked. Silas looked up from his bowl. "No." "Then what happens to us?" "I don't know." "If you send us back out there, we'll probably—" Thomas stopped, because Eliza had put her hand on his arm, but he'd already said enough. Silas set his spoon down too. He looked at the boy for a moment, then at Eliza. "There's a town called Millhaven, about 20 miles east," he said. "They've got a county office there. Someone would—" "We went to Harlan's Crossing," Eliza said. "They told us to move on." "Millhaven's bigger." "And what do they do with children at the county office?" He didn't answer immediately. "They separate them," she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at his bowl. "Sometimes." "Not sometimes. That's what they do. They put them in different places and they call it helping, and they never end up in the same place." She wasn't raising her voice. She was stating a fact. "My mother made me promise we'd stay together. I'm going to keep that promise." "You're 13 years old." "I know how old I am. Keeping 5 children together on your own isn't—" "I know what it isn't." She met his eyes. "I'm not asking you to solve it. I'm asking you to let us sleep somewhere warm tonight so I can figure out what to do next." He looked at her for a long time. She didn't look away. Then Owen, who hadn't said a word in 4 days, raised his head from where it had been resting against Biscuit's side and looked across the room at Silas with the direct, unfiltered attention of a 5-year-old who has no concept of what he's not supposed to say. "Are you going to make us leave in the dark?" Owen asked. The words landed in the room and sat there. Silas opened his mouth, closed it again. The muscle in his jaw moved. "No," he said, after a moment that felt long enough to have seasons in it. "Not in the dark. I'm mad." He gave them the back room, a room that had clearly not been used in some time, with a layer of dust on the floor and 2 narrow beds pushed against the walls. The beds had mattresses, which was more than the wagon had. Eliza helped Clara and Owen into one bed, tucked his coat around them since there were only 2 blankets in the room, and sent Thomas and Jacob to the other. She herself sat on the floor with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up, listening to the sounds of the house settling in the cold. She could hear Silas moving around in the main room, the creak of a chair, the occasional knock of something being set down. He was still awake too, and she lay there in the dark wondering what he was thinking, wondering what kind of man points a rifle at children and then feeds them dinner, who makes his meaning perfectly clear and then says not in the dark when a 5-year-old asks him a question. What kind of man does that? A man with something buried in him, she thought, something that doesn't want to stay buried. She wasn't sure yet whether that was a problem or not. She woke before anyone else, which was normal. The house was cold and gray with early light, and she found her way to the kitchen by memory, stirred the coals in the stove and fed in a few pieces of wood the way her mother had taught her, and then stood there with her hands over the growing heat and thought about what she knew. She knew they had one more day with the wagon, after which it needed to go back to Harlan's Crossing, or the man who'd lent it would come looking for it. She knew they had some money, enough maybe for 1 week's worth of food if they were careful, and nothing after that. She knew the county office in Millhaven would separate them. She knew, as certainly as she knew anything, that if they were separated, she would lose at least some of them forever. Not because the places they'd be sent were necessarily terrible, she genuinely didn't know that, but because the world was big and distances were real, and she was 13 years old and had no power over where children got sent once the county decided. She heard a step behind her and turned. Silas stood in the doorway of the kitchen in a work shirt and trousers, boots already on, hat in his hand. He looked at her without surprise, which suggested he'd heard her moving. "How long have you been up?" he said. "Half an hour, maybe." He moved past her to the stove, checked her work on the fire with the brief, unconscious assessment of someone who does it by habit, and put on the coffee pot. "The wagon needs to go back today," Eliza said. "I know. We can take it ourselves if you'll tell us the road to Harlan's Crossing." He was quiet for a moment, measuring coffee into the pot with a bent spoon. "It's 20 miles east-southeast. You'd be there and back in a day if you left now." We could do that. In November. He turned and looked at her. With a 5-year-old. We've been doing things like that. I can see that. He said it without any particular inflection. I'll take the wagon back. You stay here. She stared at him. You don't need to. It's faster with one rider than 5 children. He turned back to the stove. I'll be back before dark. Don't go into the barn without someone over there with you. One of the horses kicks, and it's not predictable about which direction. She kept staring. Why are you doing this? He was quiet long enough that she wasn't sure he was going to answer. I don't entirely know, he said. Don't read too much into it. He was gone for most of the day, and in his absence, Eliza let herself actually look at the ranch. It was, she thought, a place that had been good once and had fallen into a kind of careful neglect. Not abandonment, not decay, just the slow withdrawal that happens when someone maintains a thing without caring about it. The house was structurally solid. The barn was better built than it looked from the road. The fencing was in reasonable repair. The cattle she could see from the back window were in decent shape, ribs not showing, coats thick for winter. Thomas went to the barn in the morning with strict instructions to stay away from the kicking horse. He came back an hour later with the information that there were 2 horses, 3 milk cows, and more chickens than he'd been able to count. Chickens mean eggs, Clara said. I know what chickens mean, Thomas said. He's only got 2 plates, Jacob offered. He'd been in the house exploring with the methodical curiosity of a boy who wants to understand the geography of a place. 2 plates and 1 cup, and he hesitated. There's a room he keeps locked. Eliza looked at him. Jacob. I didn't try to open it. I just noticed it was locked. Don't notice locked doors. He went quiet. But she'd noticed it too, that door at the end of the short hallway, the keyhole where other doors in the house had none. A room someone kept locked in a house where someone lived alone was a room someone was protecting. She didn't let herself think about it too much. It wasn't her business. Silas came back 2 hours before dark, on horseback, with an extra horse on a lead, a purchase, she'd learn later, from a man at the edge of Harlan's Crossing who'd been trying to sell it for 3 seasons. He didn't explain the purchase. He unsaddled both horses, turned them into the paddock, and came inside to find the kitchen clean, the stove going strong, and a pot of beans already started from what was left in the larder. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the beans and then at Eliza. You didn't have to do that, he said. You were gone all day, she said. The least we could do. He hung his hat and sat down at the table. Across the room, Owen was on the floor with Biscuit again, the dog's head in his lap, both of them apparently asleep. How's Owen doing? Silas said. It caught her off guard, the question. She turned from the stove. What? The little one. He hasn't spoken. He talked last night. She turned back to the pot. You heard him. One question. He'll come back around. She kept her voice even. He found our mother. He was the one sitting with her when she stopped. He'll be fine. A pause. How old was he when your father left? Silas said. She looked at him. How did you know our father left? He had the grace to look slightly discomfited. 5 children, no father with them, mother dying on the road. It didn't take much working out. He left 2 years ago. She turned back to the stove. Owen barely remembers him. Another pause. Silas reached out and adjusted the position of his empty cup on the table, a small, unnecessary motion. I had a son, he said. She didn't say anything. He'd have been about the same age as your youngest, give or take. She didn't say anything to that either. She wasn't sure what the right response was, and she'd learned that silence was usually safer than the wrong words. What happened? She said finally, because the silence had gone on long enough. Fever. 6 years ago. He picked up the cup and put it down again. Wife went 2 years before that. Different fever, same end. She turned from the stove and looked at him. This man who'd come to the door of his own house with a rifle, who'd fed them anyway, who'd driven 20 miles to return a borrowed wagon and come back with an extra horse he didn't need. I'm sorry, she said. Don't be sorry. He said it the same way he'd said don't thank me. Not unkindly, but with the firm precision of a man who has decided what he can and cannot receive. It was a long time ago. It doesn't feel like a long time ago, she said. He looked at her. The way you live, she said, not intending to say it but saying it anyway. It doesn't feel like it was a long time ago. He was quiet for a moment. Then, no, it doesn't. That night, after the children were asleep, Eliza sat by the fire with Silas in a silence that was, for the first time, not entirely uncomfortable. The dog had shifted from Owen to the hearthrug and was snoring softly. Outside, the November wind had picked up and was working on the corners of the house. "You can't stay," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the fire. "I know. I mean it. This isn't, He stopped, started again. "I run a working ranch. It's not a place for children." "We're useful," she said. "Thomas and Jacob know cattle work. Claire can cook better than she looks like she can, and I can do most of what a ranch hand does." "You're 13. You said that already." "Because it bears repeating. There's nobody else," she said quietly. "That's not me trying to make you feel bad about it. That's just what's true. There is nobody else. You are the first person who hasn't told us to keep moving." He didn't respond to that. "1 week," she said. "Give us 1 week. We'll work for our keep, and we won't be a trouble to you. And at the end of the week, if you want us gone, we'll go." "And go where?" "That'll be my problem." He turned to look at her then, and she looked back at him, and for a moment she could see him working it through. All of it, the inconvenience and the risk, and whatever it was he kept locked behind that door at the end of the hall. All the reasons why no was the only sensible answer. 1 week, he said finally. She didn't smile, because smiling felt like pushing her luck. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said, and turned back to the fire. She looked at the fire too. Outside, the wind hammered at the eaves of a house that had been empty of living for a very long time, and inside 5 children breathed in the dark, and a man stared into the coals of something he hadn't expected to feel again. 3 days into the week, Thomas fixed the gate on the north pasture that had been hanging wrong since before any of them arrived. He did it with tools he found in the barn and wire he asked Silas permission to use, and he did it without being asked or told. When Silas came around the fence line that afternoon and found the gate swinging clean on its new hinges, he stood there for a moment with an expression that had no name Eliza could give it. "Thomas did that," she said, from where she was working on a section of rotten fence posts nearby. Silas looked at her. "How old is Thomas?" 11. He looked at the gate again, then he walked on without saying anything. But the next morning, he showed Thomas how to check the post depth before it got set in ground, and how to read the angle of a fence line when the ground shifted. Thomas listened with the focused intensity of a boy who has decided this person is worth learning from, and he didn't ask questions until Silas paused, and when he asked them, they were good questions. Eliza watched this from the barn, where she was milking, a task she'd offered to take over because the rhythm of it was soothing in a way she hadn't expected, and because the barn was one of the few places on the property where she could be alone for 20 minutes and allow herself to feel tired. She was very tired. She was 13 years old, and she had been holding 5 people together through willpower and stubbornness for 4 days. And before that, she'd been holding them together while her mother got worse. And before that, she'd been holding them together while her father's absence had eaten through the family like something slow and corrosive. She was so tired she sometimes couldn't feel the edges of herself anymore. But the gate swung clean on its hinges. And Owen had said 6 words that morning, not to anyone in particular, just to Biscuit, crouched down and murmuring, "Good dog, good dog, good dog." But it was the most he'd said since he'd climbed up beside his mother in the wagon and found out that the world could take things you needed. 1 week, she thought. 1 week, and she'd figure out the rest. She didn't know yet that 1 week was going to be the least of what she'd have to figure out. On the 5th day, 2 men on horseback came down the road toward the ranch. Eliza saw them from the pasture where she was working, and something in the way they were riding, purposeful, unhurried, in a way that suggested they knew where they were going and had the authority to go there, made her stomach drop before she could identify why. She went to find Silas. He was in the barn with Thomas, going over the saddle rigging on the new horse, and when she came through the barn door with her expression arranged carefully and said, "There are 2 men coming," he read her face and handed Thomas the stirrup leather without a word. By the time they got to the front of the house, the men had dismounted. One was perhaps 50, heavy-set, wearing a coat with county office insignia that had seen better days. The other was younger, with a clipboard and the general air of a man who has been given a job he doesn't entirely like. "This the Boone property?" the older one said. "It is," Silas said. "I'm Deputy Acker, Tillman County. We've had a report of unaccompanied minors traveling in the area. 5 of them, traveling without a guardian. Word out of Harlan's Crossing says they might have come this direction." His eyes found Eliza, then went to the door of the house where Clara had appeared, and beyond her to Thomas standing at the corner of the barn. "Looks like we've found them." Eliza's hands, at her sides, closed into fists. "These children are with me," Silas said. The deputy looked at him. "Are you a relation?" "No." "Then you're not—" "I said they're with me." Acker's expression settled into something practiced, the look of a man who has had versions of this conversation before and knows how they end. "Sir, county law requires that unaccompanied minors be remanded to the custody of county services until suitable placements." "They have a placement," Silas said. "Sir, they have a placement," he said again, with a kind of flat certainty that was different from argument. He wasn't raising his voice. He was simply refusing to move. "Right here." Acker looked at the younger man with the clipboard, who was writing something down and not looking up. "Mr. Boone," Acker said carefully, "I understand you mean well, but meaning well isn't the same as being qualified to be— Come back in a month," Silas said. Come back in a month and see how we're doing." "I can't do that. County requires—" "I know what county requires." Silas took one step forward, not aggressive, but deliberate, the step of a man establishing where the ground is. "I'm telling you to come back in a month. These children aren't leaving this property." There was a long silence. Eliza held very still. She could feel Thomas at the corner of the barn behind her and Clara in the doorway, and she was acutely aware that Owen was somewhere inside the house and that Silas had just said clearly in front of a county deputy that these children were not leaving. She was not sure what that meant. She was not sure it meant anything permanent, but it was the most definitive thing any adult had said on their behalf since her mother had told her, "Promise me," in the back of a wagon outside a town whose name she still couldn't pronounce. "I'll need to make a record of this," Acker said finally. "Make it," Silas said. The deputy's jaw tightened. He turned to the younger man. "Write it down. Boone property, children present, rancher claims informal custody, county to follow up within 30 days. The younger man wrote it down. Acker looked at Silas one more time. 30 days, Mr. Boone. Have something more official than your word ready." "I'll have something ready," Silas said. They mounted and rode back the way they'd come. Eliza stood in the yard and watched them go, and then turned and looked at Silas, who was still standing at the edge of the porch watching the road. "What does that mean?" she asked. Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "What does more official than your word mean?" He was quiet for a moment. "It means I've got about 30 days to figure out how to make this legal." She stared at him. "Make what legal?" He turned and looked at her, and the expression on his face was not confident. It was not smooth or certain or resolved. He looked like a man who has just said something out loud that he hadn't fully thought through, and was now facing the consequences of it, and wasn't sure yet whether he'd made a terrible mistake. "Us," he said. "This." He gestured at the ranch, at the house, at Clara in the doorway, and Thomas at the corner of the barn. "I need to figure out how to make this legal." A week ago, he'd pointed a rifle at them, and now he was standing in his own yard looking slightly stunned by himself, trying to figure out how to become a father. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," she said. "Just that." He looked back at her. "Okay," she said again. "Let's figure it out." The morning after Deputy Acker rode away, Silas sat at his kitchen table before anyone else was awake and stared at the grain of the wood like it owed him an answer. He'd said, "us." He'd said this. He'd waved his hand at a collection of children who'd been on his property for less than a week and told a county deputy they were staying, and now the wood grain wasn't giving him anything useful, and the coffee had gone cold, and somewhere in the back room 5 children were breathing in the dark, entirely unaware of the scope of what he'd just committed himself to. He was not by nature an impulsive man. He'd spent 6 years being very deliberate about everything. What he ate, when he slept, how he worked, how he kept himself from feeling things that would knock him sideways if he let them. Deliberate and careful and contained. And then a 5-year-old had asked him if he was going to make them leave in the dark. And something in him had cracked open like old wood in a hard frost, and now here he was. He got up. He put this cold coffee on the stove to reheat. He thought about what Acker had said. 30 days. Have something more official than your word ready. And he tried to work out what that meant practically. It meant a lawyer, or someone who functioned like one out here. And it meant paperwork. And it meant appearing before someone with the authority to make this legal, rather than just stated. It meant he heard bare feet on the floorboards and turned. Owen stood in the doorway of the kitchen in an oversized shirt that reached his knees, his hair going in 4 directions. Biscuit at his heels like they'd already established a partnership that neither of them needed to discuss. The boy looked at Silas without any of the wariness his older sister carried. Owen was too young for wariness, or maybe just too tired to manage it. "Is there food?" Owen said. "There will be," Silas said. Owen padded across the kitchen and climbed onto the bench at the table and folded his hands on the wood and waited with the patience of a child who has learned that waiting is mostly what you do. Biscuit lay down under the bench and put his chin on Owen's foot. Silas stood at the stove and thought that he genuinely did not know what to do with any of this. "You're up early," he said. "I always wake up early," Owen said. "Mama used to say I had a rooster in my head." He considered this. "I don't know what that means exactly." "It means you wake up before you need to." Owen nodded like that confirmed something. "Do you have a rooster in your head?" "Some mornings." "Is today one of them?" Silas looked at the boy. "Yeah," he said. "Today's one of them." Duh. He told Eliza about what he was thinking over breakfast when the others were occupied. Thomas and Jacob already headed toward the barn, Clara washing bowls with the focused industry of a girl who's decided that usefulness is its own form of security. "There's a man in Millhaven," Silas said, "name of Garrett Poole. He handles legal matters for ranchers in the county. Land disputes, water rights, that kind of thing. He's not a proper lawyer, but he knows the county statutes better than most judges do." He paused. "I'm going to ride to Millhaven tomorrow and talk to him." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from him?" "I need to know what formal custody looks like and how to get it. And I need to know if there's anything in the county record that'll work against us." She looked up. "Like what?" He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at the table. "Like the fact that I have no family here, no wife, no blood relation to any of you, and—" He stopped. "And what?" He was quiet long enough that she knew he was deciding how much to say. "And some of the people in Millhaven have long memories." She studied him. "What does that mean?" "It means there was a time, maybe 15 years ago, when my name wasn't entirely clean." He looked up and met her eyes. "I wasn't an outlaw. Nothing like that. But there was a bad winter and a land dispute with a neighbor that got out of hand and people got hurt. Nobody died, but people got hurt. And some of the people in that county office were alive when it happened." Eliza thought about this for a moment. "Did you do something wrong?" "I did something that could have been handled differently," he said. "That's the most honest answer I've got." She nodded slowly. "Okay. Okay. Nobody's clean," she said. "My father wasn't clean. My mother wasn't either, for that matter, though hers was just talking when she should have listened." She picked up her cup. "I'm not looking for perfect. I'm looking for someone who's going to still be standing at the end of 30 days. Silas looked at her across the table. 13 years old, with her mother's quilt in the back room and 4 children depending on her and the kind of eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by much more. "I'll still be standing," he said. "Good," she said. "Then go to Millhaven." But he left before dawn the next morning and came back after dark, which told Eliza the conversation with Garrett Poole had been either very long or very complicated, and probably both. She had a plate on the stove when he came through the door, and she set it on the table without asking. He sat down and ate in silence for a few minutes, and she sat across from him and waited, because she'd learned that pushing Silas for information before he was ready to give it got her less than waiting did. "It's possible," he said finally. "What we're trying to do. It's possible, but it's not simple." "What does it need?" "Testimony from people in the community who can speak to my character and the state of the ranch. Documentation of the children's circumstances. The mother's death, the father's absence, and—" He set his fork down. Poole says the county judge who handles custody matters is a man named Harlan Briggs. Briggs has a reputation for being thorough, which Poole says means he's going to look at everything, my history included. The land dispute, among other things. He picked up the fork again. Poole also says there's a woman in the county who matters in these situations. A widow named Nora Voss. She runs a homestead about 8 miles north of here, been in the county 20 years, and Briggs respects her opinion more than almost anyone else's. He paused. Poole says if Nora Voss speaks in my favor at the hearing, it changes things significantly. Does she know you? She knows of me. Whether that's the same as knowing me in a useful way, he shook his head. I need to go talk to her. Then go talk to her. It's not that simple. Nora Voss doesn't, he stopped, seemed to choose his words. She doesn't suffer fools, or people she thinks are wasting her time. I need to go out there with something more than a request. Eliza thought about this. Take us with you. He looked at her. Take us. Let her see them. She gestured vaguely toward the back of the house where the children were asleep. You can explain the situation all you want, but she's going to make up her mind about those kids the minute she sees them. Let her see them. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then, reluctantly, that might be right. It is right. She stood and picked up his empty plate. When do we go? End of the week. I need to get some more fence work done before I can take a day off the property. Fine. She turned toward the stove. We'll be ready. The fence work took 3 days, and it didn't take 3 days because there was so much of it. It took 3 days because on the second morning, Thomas pulled a fence post out of the ground and discovered it was rotten through the base. And then they checked the next one, and it was the same. And by the time they'd walked the entire south line, they'd found 11 posts that needed replacing, not the 3 Silas had planned for. Should have checked them in August, Silas said, standing in the south pasture, looking at the row of compromised posts with an expression that mixed irritation with something closer to resignation. We can fix them, Thomas said. He was standing with his hands on his hips in a way that was either an unconscious imitation of Silas or just what 11-year-old boys do when they're trying to look like they know what they're talking about. I know we can fix them. It's going to take longer than I wanted. I can help, Jacob said. You've been helping, Thomas told him, in the slightly condescending tone of an older brother who means well and communicates it poorly. I mean, I can do more. I can dig. Jacob picked up the post hole digger from where it was leaning against the fence. He was 9 and not large, and the tool was nearly as tall as he was, but he held it with the determined grip of a boy who has decided he's going to be useful regardless of what his body thinks about it. Silas watched him for a moment. Then he came over and adjusted Jacob's grip on the tool, moved his hand slightly, showed him the angle, explained where the leverage was without turning it into a lesson, just a brief correction, matter of fact. Jacob tried it, got 3 inches of November ground on the first attempt, which wasn't nothing. Better? Silas said, and moved on to the next post. Jacob dug. His hands blistered before noon. He didn't mention it. They made it to Nora Voss's homestead on Saturday, all 6 of them in the wagon Silas had hitched his 2 horses to, which made for a crowded bench and a bed full of children who were either sleeping against each other or arguing in the muted, tired way of siblings who've been in close quarters long enough to have run out of fresh grievances and are recycling old ones. The Voss property was 8 miles north as promised, up a track that climbed steadily through stands of pine and opened into a valley that was smaller than Silas's spread, but demonstrably better maintained. The fences were tight. The house had been recently whitewashed, or as recently as you could manage in Montana in November, which meant sometime in the past year. There was a woodpile stacked with the mathematical precision of someone who takes the work seriously, and a kitchen garden put to bed for winter with the kind of care that suggested it would come back in spring. The woman who came out of the house when they pulled into the yard was perhaps 60, compact and straight-backed, with white hair pinned severely and the dark, sharp eyes of someone who has spent decades watching things and making accurate assessments of them. She looked at the wagon. She looked at the children. She looked at Silas. Boone, she said, not a greeting exactly, an acknowledgement. Mrs. Voss. He climbed down from the bench. Thank you for agreeing to see us. I agreed to hear what you had to say. I haven't agreed to anything else. Her eyes moved to Eliza, who was climbing down from the bench with Owen on her hip. "Who's this?" "Eliza Ashcroft," Eliza said, before Silas could answer. "These are my brothers and sister, Thomas, Jacob, Clara, and Owen." Nora Voss looked at each child in turn. Her expression was not warm, but it wasn't unkind either. It was the face of a woman who makes up her mind based on what she actually sees and is in the process of seeing. "Come inside," she said. "All of you." Check. The inside of Nora Voss's house was warm and precise and absolutely full of books. More books than Eliza had seen in any house that wasn't a library, stacked on shelves that covered most of 2 walls, and a few piles on the floor beside a reading chair near the fire. Clara immediately went toward them with the helpless attraction of a child who has always loved books and hasn't had access to any for a very long time. "You can look," Nora said, which was the first thing she'd said that sounded like anything approaching softness. "Don't touch the ones on the bottom shelf. Those are fragile." Clara touched nothing on the bottom shelf. She stood in front of the other shelves with her hands clasped behind her back and read titles with the focused reverence of a person in a very good museum. Nora set water on for tea and directed them to sit, and then she sat across from Silas and looked at him with the directness of someone who has earned the right to skip the social preamble. "Garrett Poole told me you were coming," she said. "He also told me what you're trying to do and why." "Then you know the situation," Silas said. "I know the outline of it." Her eyes moved briefly to Eliza, then back. "I want to hear the rest from you." So he told her. He was not a storyteller by nature, and it showed. He gave her the facts in order, without embellishment, occasionally stopping to correct a sequence or add something he'd left out. Eliza filled in the gaps where she could, briefly and without drama, and Nora listened to both of them without interrupting. When they were done, Nora was quiet for a moment. "And the children," she said. "Do they want to be there? On your ranch?" Silas opened his mouth. "I'm asking them," Nora said, without looking at him. A short silence. Then Thomas, who had been sitting very still on the edge of his chair in the way he sat when he was paying serious attention, said, "Yes." "Why?" Nora said. Thomas thought about it. He had the habit, unusual in an 11-year-old, of actually thinking before he answered a question rather than just talking. "Because he doesn't pretend," he said finally. "Most adults pretend they're going to help you and then don't. He said he couldn't promise anything, and then he fixed it anyway." Nora looked at Jacob, who said, "He showed me how to use a post hole digger," which wasn't quite an answer to the question but was, in its own way, a complete one. Clara said, "He refilled my bowl without me having to ask." Owen, sitting beside Eliza with Biscuit's absence apparently still on his mind, the dog had stayed behind at the ranch, looked at Nora Voss and said, "He didn't leave." The room was quiet. Nora Voss looked at the 5-year-old for a moment. Then she looked at Silas, and something in her expression had shifted. Not dramatically, not warmly, but the quality of her attention had changed. "There's going to be a formal hearing," she said. "Judge Briggs runs a thorough process. He'll look at the ranch. He'll talk to people in the county, and he'll look at your history, Silas. The Caldwell business." "I know." "Do the children know?" Silas looked at Eliza. "She knows the outline of it." Nora nodded slowly. "I'll speak at the hearing," she said. "I'll say what I can say honestly, which is that I've known of Silas Boone for 20 years, and whatever he did in the Caldwell matter, it wasn't the action of a cruel man. It was the action of a desperate one. There's a difference, and Briggs knows that." She paused. "But I'll also say that the ranch needs to be in demonstrably good order when they come to inspect it. Not perfect. Good. There's a distinction." "Understood," Silas said. She looked at Eliza. "And you need to be prepared to speak about your mother's death and your father's absence in front of a judge and whatever county officers are present. That's not easy." "I know," Eliza said. "Do you? It's one thing to say it to me in a warm kitchen. It's another thing entirely to say it out loud in a room full of people who are trying to decide your future." Eliza met her eyes. "I've been saying hard things out loud my whole life," she said. "I'll be fine." Nora held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once like a door closing on a debate. "All right," she said. "I'll be at the hearing." On the way home, with the children asleep in the wagon bed and the horses picking their way carefully along the darkening road, Silas said, "You did well in there." Eliza was looking at the road ahead. She did most of the work. No, she didn't. He was quiet for a moment. What Owen said, that landed. Owen says what he means, Eliza said. He always has. He doesn't know how to do it any other way. That's not a bad way to be. No, she agreed. It's not. The wagon moved along in the dark. Above the tree line, the stars were very bright, the way they get in Montana when the temperature drops and the air has nothing in it. What's the Caldwell business? Eliza asked. He was quiet for a moment. A man named Caldwell tried to take a piece of my land by altering a survey record 15 years ago. I found out and I went to his property to confront him. Things got out of hand. His son got between us and I hit him hard enough to break his collarbone. He paused. The son was 17. He wasn't part of what his father was doing. What happened after? I paid a fine. Caldwell's survey fraud came out eventually, and he lost the land he'd been trying to steal. His son healed. He picked up the reins slightly to guide the horse around a rut in the road. But people remember, and some of them still think I'm the kind of man who hurts people when he's angry. Are you? He was quiet for a moment. I was. Once. Another pause. I work not to be. Eliza looked at the road. That's the most honest thing you've said to me. He glanced at her sideways. Don't go reading too much into it. I'm not reading anything into it. She pulled her coat tighter. I'm just noting it. The work that followed Nora Voss's agreement was not glamorous. It was 3 weeks of sustained effort that started before full light most mornings and didn't stop until the light was gone. And it required every person on the property to do more than they'd done before. The south fence line got finished, all 11 posts replaced, the wire run taut and stapled, the corners braced against the winter. Thomas did most of the heavy post work by the end, with Jacob handling the wire runs, and Silas moved between them doing the parts that required experience rather than strength. The barn got mucked out properly for the first time in what was, based on the evidence, at least 2 years. Clara took over the chickens entirely, which freed Silas from a daily task he'd been managing badly and badly resentfully, and the milk cows started giving better once someone was paying them consistent attention. Owen helped where he could, which was mostly in the way that a 5-year-old helps. Not with the actual tasks, but with the ambient morale of the operation. He had rediscovered words fully now, not in a rush, but steadily, 1 or 2 more each day, and he had a particular gift for asking questions at exactly the moment when someone needed a reason to stop and explain what they were doing, rather than just doing it grimly. Why does the wire need to be that tight? He asked Jacob, standing at the fence line with his hands in his pockets and his breath making clouds. Because if it's loose, the cattle push through it, Jacob said. Why do the cattle push through it? Because cattle are... Jacob paused, looked at Silas. Persistent, Silas said. Persistent, Jacob repeated to Owen. Owen considered this. Are we persistent? A short silence. Yeah, Jacob said. I think we are. The thing nobody talked about in those 3 weeks was the locked door at the end of the hall. Eliza had told the others not to go near it, and they'd respected that. Even Jacob, whose curiosity was the kind that usually required active suppression. But she thought about it, especially on the nights when she heard Silas moving around after the children were asleep, those slow, restless movements in the main room that told her he wasn't sleeping either. She thought about a man who lived alone in a house with a locked door and 2 plates on a shelf, and she thought about the way he'd said my son would have been about the same age. She didn't ask. It wasn't her place to ask. But one evening, about 10 days before the scheduled hearing, she came into the main room from the kitchen and found Silas sitting at the table with a small wooden horse in his hands, a carved thing, worn smooth from handling, that he was turning over and over between his fingers, the way you turn something you've held so many times, it's become a physical habit. He heard her and looked up, and she saw him see that she'd noticed the horse, and she watched him very briefly consider putting it away, and then not. Did you make that? She asked. My wife did, he said. She carved better than she cooked, which was saying something. He set it down on the table between them. She gave it to our son the winter before she got sick. He carried it everywhere. Eliza looked at the horse. The grain of the wood was visible through years of handling, and there was a small repair on one of the front legs where it had apparently broken and been carefully glued back together. He must have dropped it, she said, constantly. The corner of Silas's mouth moved. He was not a careful child. She sat down across from him. What was his name? Henry. He picked up the horse again. He called it Runner because it had its front legs up. He tilted the horse to show her. He said it was running somewhere. He just didn't know where yet. Eliza looked at the small carved animal. Maybe it was coming here, she said. She wasn't sure why she said it. It was the kind of thing she'd normally have kept back. But it was late, and the fire was low, and she was tired down to her bones. And sometimes when you're that tired, the things you keep back stop staying back. Silas looked at the horse for a long moment. He didn't answer, but he set it down on the table between them and left it there rather than putting it in his pocket, which felt like something. You should sleep, he said. We've got a full day tomorrow. I know. She stood. Silas? He looked up. Thank you, she said. I know you tell me not to say that, but I'm going to keep saying it until you let me mean it. He looked at her for a moment, then, get some sleep, Eliza. She went. 7 days before the hearing, the drifter showed up. He came down the road on a tired horse in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, and the first thing Eliza noticed was that he was watching the property with more attention than a passing traveler would use. He stopped on the road for a moment, just stopped, looking, and then rode on without coming to the gate. She told Silas at dinner he was quiet for longer than she'd have liked. Description, he said, tall, dark coat, hat with a flat brim, beard going gray. Another pause. That might be nothing. Or, he looked at the table. There's a man named Creed Halsey who's been buying up land in this county for the last 3 years. Small parcels, failed homesteads, anything that comes available. He's been trying to acquire the water rights on the creek that runs through my eastern pasture for about 2 years. He looked up. He doesn't do his own dirty work, but the people he employs tend to show up looking like that. What kind of dirty work? Thomas asked. He'd been very still at his end of the table. The kind that makes a man look unreliable to a judge, Silas said. Rumors, reputation damage, or sometimes just damage. He said the last part flatly, without drama. I don't know that it's him. I'm telling you what I know. What do we do? Jacob said. We stay alert, Silas said. We don't go anywhere alone, and we pay attention to anything that looks wrong. He looked at the children in turn. And nobody talks to strangers about what's happening with the custody hearing. Not in town, not anywhere. The children nodded. Owen looked at Biscuit, who was under the table, apparently untroubled. What about the hearing? Eliza said. If someone's trying to damage your reputation, then we make sure there's nothing to damage, Silas said. We've been doing that. We keep doing it. She looked at him. He looked like a man who's managing more than he's showing, which she'd come to recognize as his baseline, but there was something tighter in it tonight. A tension around the jaw that told her the drifter on the road had landed harder than he was letting on. You've dealt with worse than this, she said. It was half question, half statement. I've dealt with worse, he said, but I had less to lose. The table was quiet for a moment. Then Owen, with the uncanny timing he'd developed for cutting through things, said, Can Biscuit sleep in our room tonight? Silas looked at him. Biscuit sleeps where he wants. I know, but can he want to sleep in our room? The tension around Silas's jaw loosened, fractionally, against what appeared to be his will. I'll mention it to him, he said. The drifter came back 2 days later, this time stopping at the gate. Silas was working in the barn when Eliza came to get him, and he walked out to the gate with the unhurried stride of a man who has decided in advance what his expression is going to be. Eliza followed at a distance she'd judged as close enough to hear and far enough not to be in the way. The man on the horse was exactly as she'd described. Tall, gray-bearded, watching the property with the assessing eyes of someone taking inventory. Help you with something? Silas said. Maybe. The man's voice was easy, unhurried. I'm looking for the Boone spread. That you? It is. I heard you've been taking in children. I've heard that too, Silas said. What's your interest? The man smiled, and it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach anything above the teeth. I represent a party who's been watching this section of land for some time. Interested in making you a fair offer on the water rights, east pasture. Not for sale. Maybe not today, but if things get complicated. He glanced toward the house where Clara had appeared in the doorway. Complicated situations have a way of changing a man's options. Silas was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has weight. You can tell whoever sent you that my options are fine, and that if you or anyone working for the same party comes on this property uninvited, I'll deal with it the way I deal with trespassing. The man studied him. You know how that sounds? I know how it sounds, Silas said. I know how it is too. There's a difference. Another of those smiles. Then the man turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. Silas stood at the gate watching him go, and Eliza came up beside him and stood there too, and neither of them said anything for a moment. That was a threat, she said. That was the introduction to a threat, he said. The threat comes later, when they've had time to decide what they want to do. What do we do? He turned from the road and started walking back toward the barn. We finish fixing the east pasture fence. We make sure everything on this property looks like what it is. A working ranch with people who know what they're doing. She fell into step beside him. And if it's not enough? Then we make a different argument in court. He glanced at her sideways. You said you'd be fine saying hard things in front of a judge. I will be. Good. He pulled the barn door open. Because hard things are starting to look like our main product around here. She made a sound that was almost, not quite, a laugh. Inside the barn, the horses shifted in their stalls. Somewhere up near the house, Owen was calling for Biscuit in the matter-of-fact tone of a boy who is used to being answered. The afternoon was cold and the work was not done, and the hearing was 6 days away. Eliza went back to work. Shit. 3 days before the hearing, the rumor reached them through Nora Voss, who rode down from her property on a gray mare and arrived at the kitchen door with the expression of a woman who has something to say and is going to say it whether you're ready or not. There's talk in Millhaven, she said, sitting across from Silas at the kitchen table, while the children made themselves useful elsewhere at Eliza's direction. Someone's been putting it around that you're not fit to have custody of children, that your history with the Caldwell boy shows a pattern of violence, and that the children are being kept here more or less as unpaid labor. Silas's expression did not change significantly. Who? Nobody's saying directly, but it aligns with what I understand about Creed Halsey's methods. She put her hands flat on the table. Briggs is going to have heard it. He'll be thorough enough that he won't rule on it alone, but he'll be looking harder. What do we need? Eliza said. She was standing near the stove, had come back in for something, and stayed. Nora looked at her. Character witnesses who can speak to what they've seen here in the past 3 weeks. Not people who knew Silas before. People who've been on this property and can say what it's like now. There's you, Silas said. There's me. But one witness from someone known to be on your side isn't enough to balance a rumor. She thought for a moment. The man who lent you the wagon from Harlan's Crossing. What did he make of you when you returned it? Silas thought about this. He was civil enough. Seemed surprised I came back to return it personally. That's something. I'll reach out to him. She looked at the table, then back at Silas. And I think the children need to speak, not just about practical matters, about what the ranch is actually like. Briggs responds to people who say plain, specific things. He distrusts rehearsed speeches. They're not going to be rehearsed, Eliza said. I know that. Nora looked at her steadily. I'm trusting that. She stood to go, and Silas walked her to the door. Eliza heard them talking in the low, brief way of people exchanging information they don't want overheard, and then the door closed and Silas came back to the kitchen. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at Eliza. We're going to be all right, she said. He looked at her for a moment. What makes you say that? Because we've been all right so far. She turned to the stove. And because I'm not going to let us be anything else. He was quiet. Then, you know you're 13 years old. You keep saying that, she said. I keep not caring. And in spite of everything, the hearing 3 days out, the rumor working its way through Millhaven, the drifter who'd been back on the road twice more just watching, she heard him make a sound behind her that was small and reluctant and real. She didn't turn around because she didn't want to make a big thing of it, but she held on to it anyway. The night before the hearing, nobody slept well. Eliza knew this because she was awake most of it, and at various points she heard Thomas turning on his mattress, heard Clara get up to use the outhouse, and come back and lie down and get up again 20 minutes later. Heard Owen murmuring something to Biscuit in the dark. Even the dog seemed restless, his nails clicking softly on the floorboards as he moved between the children's room and the main room and back again. Silas she heard only once, a single sound from the kitchen, the scrape of the coffee pot being moved on the stove sometime around 2 in the morning. She almost got up. She decided against it. There are things a person needs to do alone at 2 in the morning, and she'd learned to recognize the difference between alone because you want to be and alone because you're in trouble. She lay in the dark and ran through what she knew about Judge Harlan Briggs, which wasn't much, only what Nora had told them. Thorough, respected, not easily moved by sentiment but not immune to specificity. He responds to people who say plain things. She'd been saying plain things her whole life. She told herself that was enough. She wasn't entirely sure she believed it. They left the ranch before sunrise, all 6 of them in the wagon with Nora Voss riding alongside on her gray mare. The morning was brutal cold, the kind that got inside a coat no matter how well it was buttoned, and the children sat in the wagon bed pressed together for warmth with a blanket pulled over all 4 of them. Owen had Biscuit, who had apparently decided that today was a traveling day and had climbed into the wagon before anyone suggested it. Nora rode beside Silas on the bench for a while without either of them saying much. The road to Millhaven was better than the tracks they'd been managing on the ranch, and in the gray early light, the mountains to the west were pale and enormous. "How are you feeling?" Nora said eventually. "Fine," Silas said. She looked at him. "That's not what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. Like a man who made a decision he can't take back and has to live with whatever comes of it. That's more honest. "You asked for honest." She rode for a while. "Briggs is going to ask you directly about the Caldwell incident. He won't let Poole get ahead of it. He'll want to hear it from you." "I know. And you're going to tell him the truth, which is that you lost your temper and hurt a boy who didn't deserve it, and that you've spent 15 years being the kind of man who doesn't do that anymore. That's what I'm going to tell him." "Good." She adjusted her grip on the reins, because the alternative, trying to minimize it or explain it away, is the thing that'll lose you the hearing before it starts. Briggs has seen every version of a man trying to make his worst moment look smaller than it was. He can smell it. Silas looked at the road. "I'm not going to minimize it." "Then you'll be all right." In the wagon bed behind them, Thomas had fallen asleep against Jacob's shoulder, which was a thing he would deny emphatically if it came up later. Claire was watching the road ahead with quiet intensity, her lips moving slightly, which meant she was rehearsing something in her head. Owen was telling Biscuit about the mountains. Eliza sat at the back of the wagon, watching the ranch disappear around the first bend in the road, and thought about her mother, and about promises, and about what it had cost to get here, and what it might cost yet. Millhaven was larger than Harlan's Crossing by a significant margin, which admittedly wasn't saying much. It had a proper main street with a hotel and a dry goods store, and a building that served as both the county recorder's office and the courtroom, which was a common enough arrangement in counties that hadn't grown wealthy enough to justify 2 separate structures. The courtroom occupied the back half of the building, behind a wooden partition that had been erected with more optimism than skill, and it smelled like pine resin and old paper and the particular cold of a room that gets heated only when it needs to be used. Garrett Poole was waiting for them outside. He was a compact, quick-moving man of perhaps 55, with the watchful eyes of someone who has spent a lifetime reading rooms, and he shook Silas's hand and looked at the children with the brisk, assessing nod of a man confirming that what he'd been told matches what he's seeing. "Briggs arrived this morning," he said. "He's been reviewing the county record. There's also—" He paused, and the pause was the length of something he needed to be careful about. "There's a man here representing Creed Halsey, name of Fletcher. He's filed a complaint with the county office, says there's concern that the children's welfare is being compromised by an arrangement with a man of known violent character." Silas's expression didn't shift. "On what grounds?" "The Caldwell incident, primarily, and they've collected some statements from people in Harlan's Crossing. A woman who says she saw the children when they first arrived in town, describing them as visibly malnourished and frightened." "They were malnourished when we found them," Eliza said. Her voice came out flat and clear. "That was before they came to the ranch." Poole looked at her. "Yes, but Fletcher is going to suggest that the conditions at the ranch haven't been significantly better." He paused. We need to be ready to counter that directly. The children look the way they look, Nora said. She'd come up beside Poole and was looking at him with the kind of steady directness that seemed to be her native mode. Anyone can see it. Nora's right, Poole said. But seeing it and having it entered into the record are different things. I'd like to request that the judge look at the children before the formal hearing begins. Let him form his own impression before Fletcher gets to present his version. Can you do that? Silas said. I can ask. He's a practical man. If I explain that the condition of the children is being misrepresented, he'll want to assess that himself. Poole glanced back toward the building. Wait here. I'll be back in 5 minutes. He went. The 6 of them stood in the cold street outside the courthouse, and Clara moved closer to Eliza without saying anything, and Thomas squared his shoulders in the way he did when he was trying to look older than he was, and Jacob crouched down to talk to Biscuit in a murmur that nobody could hear. Are we going to be all right? Clara asked. Yes, Eliza said. She said it immediately, without hesitation, the way she'd learned to say things that needed to be true, even when she wasn't certain of them. Owen looked up from Biscuit. What if the judge says no? He's not going to say no, Thomas said, with the older sibling authority he deployed when he didn't want to think about the alternative. But what if he does? Silas crouched down to Owen's level. It was the first time Eliza had seen him do that. Drop deliberately to a child's height, put himself where he could be looked at directly. His knees cracked when he did it, which was not a dignified sound, and he didn't seem to care. If he says no today, Silas said, I go back to Garrett Poole and we find another way. There's always another way. Owen looked at him seriously. You promise? Silas was quiet for just a beat. Then, yeah, I promise. Owen nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to Biscuit. Silas straightened up slowly, his knees doing that again, and caught Eliza looking at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything. Poole came back in 4 minutes. Briggs had agreed. The judge turned out to be a smaller man than Eliza had expected from his reputation, lean and dry, perhaps 60, with a close-cut gray beard and the careful, unhurried movements of someone who has long since stopped rushing anything. He came out of the building and looked at the 6 of them on the street with the same assessing directness that Nora Voss had used, and Eliza had the impression that the 2 of them would get along. He spent about 10 minutes with the children. He didn't ask leading questions or formal ones. He asked Thomas what kind of work he did on the ranch, and listened while Thomas explained the fence post situation with the focused technical detail of a boy describing something he understood well. He asked Clara if she'd learned anything new in the past few weeks, and Clara told him about the milk cows and the chickens, and also, after a moment of consideration, mentioned the books at Nora Voss's house. He looked at Jacob's hands, still showing the blisters from 3 weeks of fence work, healing now but visible, and asked how he'd gotten them, and Jacob told him plainly. Then he crouched in front of Owen, the same way Silas had, knees presumably better about the whole business. What do you do on the ranch? He said. Owen considered this seriously. I help Biscuit, he said. Briggs looked at the dog. Who's Biscuit? He came with his name, Owen said, in the tone of someone relaying established fact. Briggs looked at Silas. Your dog? Mine, Silas said. Briggs looked back at Owen. Do you like it there? On the ranch? Yes, Owen said. Why? Owen thought about it with the genuine seriousness he brought to most questions. It smells like outside, he said finally. Even inside it smells a little bit like outside. Our old places didn't smell like that. Briggs straightened up. He looked at the children for a moment, then at Silas, then at Eliza. His face was professionally composed, but there was something in his eyes that was neither warm nor cold, just very attentive. We'll start in 20 minutes, he said, and went back inside. Poole touched Silas's arm. That went well. He didn't say anything, Silas said. No, but he kept looking at them. Poole straightened his coat. With Briggs, that's the same thing. The courtroom, such as it was, had 2 long tables facing the judge's bench, a row of chairs along the wall for witnesses, and a pot-bellied stove in the corner doing its insufficient best against the November cold. The children sat along the wall with Nora Voss, and Silas and Poole sat at the left table, and at the right table sat a man Eliza hadn't seen before. Fletcher was perhaps 45, well-dressed by county standards, with the smooth and patient manner of a man who does this professionally and has won more often than he's lost. He had a leather case on the table in front of him and a slight smile that he wore the way some men wear a hat, not for warmth, but for the effect it has on other people. He looked at the children when they came in. The smile didn't change. Eliza looked back at him steadily until he looked away, which he did first. Briggs came in, sat down, and the room settled. "This is an informal hearing," Briggs said without preamble. "No jury, no formal proceeding. What I'm trying to establish is whether the current arrangement at the Boone Ranch is in the best interests of the minor children presently in residence there, and whether to grant temporary guardianship to Silas Boone pending a full custody review. Mr. Poole, Mr. Fletcher, I've read your submissions. I'm going to ask Mr. Boone to speak first, and then I'll hear from Mr. Fletcher's witnesses, and then from Mrs. Voss, and then from the children themselves." He looked around the room. "We're going to be plain with each other in here. I don't have patience for speeches." Fletcher said, "Your Honor, I'd like to note that my client's concerns are—" "You'll get your turn, Mr. Fletcher," Briggs said, without looking at him. Fletcher subsided. Silas stood. He wasn't a man who spoke easily in formal settings. This was apparent from the first sentence, which came out more slowly than his normal cadence, and from the way he held his hat in his hands in front of him and looked at Briggs directly rather than at the room. But what he said was plain, and it was honest, and it was in order. He told Briggs how the children had arrived. He told him what state they'd been in. He told him what the ranch looked like now versus 3 weeks ago, specifically. The fence line, the barn, the cattle weight, the egg production from Clara's chickens, which was a detail that felt almost absurdly small, but which Poole had told him to include because specific details were what Briggs trusted. Then Briggs said, "The Caldwell incident, tell me." And Silas told him. All of it, in the same flat and specific way. The land dispute, the altered survey, the confrontation, the moment it went wrong, the boy's collarbone, the fine, the aftermath. He didn't soften it, and he didn't dramatize it, and he didn't make excuses for himself. And when he was done, he said, "I was wrong. Not about the land. Caldwell was stealing from me. But hitting that boy was wrong, and it's been wrong every day since." Briggs looked at him for a long moment. "And you believe you're a different man now than you were then?" "I believe I've worked to be," Silas said. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you I'm certain of it. I can tell you what I've done in the past 3 weeks, and you can judge it." Briggs nodded slowly. "Sit down." Fletcher's witnesses were 2. The first was the woman from Harlan's Crossing, the one in the yellow apron, Eliza realized with a jolt, though she looked different sitting in a courtroom chair than she had in her doorway. She told the judge that she'd seen the children when they came through town, that they'd looked hungry and frightened, that the eldest girl had seemed desperate. Poole cross-examined her in the mild, careful way of a man who doesn't want to seem aggressive but needs to establish something. "When you saw the children, where were they going?" "They just left town," the woman said, "heading west." "So they were heading toward the Boone Ranch at that point?" "I suppose so." "And the condition you're describing, hungry, frightened, that was before they reached the Boone Ranch?" The woman looked at Fletcher. Fletcher was looking at his table. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it was." "Thank you," Poole said, and sat down. The second witness was a man Eliza didn't recognize, who testified to having heard, from another party he declined to name, that Silas Boone was known for a violent temperament and had been heard making threats against county officials. This was so far from anything that had actually happened that Eliza felt a cold, specific anger settle into her chest, the kind that doesn't heat up but compresses, becomes very dense and still. Poole objected to this hearsay. Briggs sustained it and told the witness his testimony on that point would not be entered into the record. The man sat down looking deflated. Fletcher made his argument. It was smooth and organized and cited 3 county statutes by number, which suggested preparation. He said that the Caldwell incident demonstrated a pattern, that a single man with no familial connection to the children and a history of violence was not a suitable guardian, that the children would be better served by the county's placement services, which could ensure they were in households with established family structures. He did not mention Creed Halsey. He did not mention the water rights. He spoke as though his only concern was the welfare of 5 children, and he did it well enough that Eliza's hands tightened in her lap. Then Nora Voss stood up. She didn't use notes. She stood with her hands at her sides and looked at Briggs directly, and spoke in the measured, unhurried voice of a woman who is accustomed to being listened to. She said she'd known of Silas Boone for 20 years. She described the Caldwell matter not as Fletcher had described it, a pattern, but as what it actually was, a single event in the context of a land theft, from a man who'd been under sustained pressure, who'd made a mistake, who'd paid for it, and who had not, in 20 years, given anyone reason to revisit it. She said that the county's placement services were not infallible, and that she had personally seen children placed by county services into situations that were considerably worse than a working ranch with an experienced rancher. She said that what she'd seen at the Boone property 3 weeks ago was a man who was doing the work, imperfectly and with clear effort, and 5 children who were alive and fed and contributing, and she paused here and chose her word carefully, rooted, like something that had been planted and was beginning to take hold. She sat down. Briggs looked at his papers for a moment, then, "I'd like to hear from the children." Thomas went first because he was the oldest after Eliza, and he'd decided this in advance, standing in the wagon that morning with the quiet authority of a boy who is learning to take up space in a room. He sat in the witness chair, a regular wooden chair moved to face the judge's bench, and looked at Briggs steadily. "Tell me what the ranch is like," Briggs said. Thomas told him. He was specific, the way Poole had told them to be. The fence posts, the milk cows, the chickens, the work schedule, what time they started and what time they stopped. He told him that Silas had taught him to check post depth before setting and to read a fence line when the ground shifted, and that he'd use that knowledge on 9 of the 11 new posts they'd set. "Do you feel safe there?" Briggs asked. Thomas thought about it the way he always thought about things, without rushing. "Yes," he said. "Not because nothing bad could happen, but because if something bad happened, I think he'd handle it." Briggs nodded. "Thank you." Jacob told the judge about the post-hole digger in his hands and the fact that Silas had shown him the correct grip without making him feel stupid for not knowing. He told it simply, in the linear way of a 9-year-old who understands that the point is in the sequence of events. Clara said, "He refilled my bowl without me asking, the first night. That's when I knew." Briggs looked at her. "Knew what?" "That he was paying attention," Clara said. "Adults who aren't paying attention don't notice when a child's bowl is empty. They're thinking about something else." Briggs wrote something down. Then Owen walked to the chair, climbed up onto it, and sat with his legs not reaching the floor and Biscuit pressing against the chair leg from below. "Owen," Briggs said, "how old are you?" 5, Owen said. "Almost 5.5. Do you understand why you're here today?" Owen looked at the room, at the tables, at Fletcher who was watching him with that professional expression, at Nora Voss along the wall, at Silas who was sitting very still at his table with his hat on the wood in front of him. "Someone has to decide if we can stay," Owen said. "That's right. And I want you to tell me, in your own words, why you think you should." Owen looked at Silas for a long moment. Silas looked back at him, and his face had the careful, compressed quality of a man trying very hard not to put any particular expression on it that might influence the boy. "He didn't rescue us," Owen said. The room was quiet. Briggs tilted his head slightly. "What do you mean?" "Rescuing is when you save someone and then you put them somewhere, like when you find a hurt bird and you put it in a box." Owen's voice was completely matter-of-fact, the voice of a child stating something he has worked out clearly in his own mind. "Silas didn't put us anywhere. We were already there, and he stayed." Eliza, along the wall, felt something move in her chest that she'd been holding back for a very long time. "He stayed," Owen repeated. "That's different." The room was silent for long enough that the pot-bellied stove's ticking became audible. Fletcher was looking at his table. Nora Voss was looking at Owen. Silas was looking at the hat in front of him. Briggs wrote something down. His face was still composed, still professionally careful, but something in the set of it had shifted in a way that was almost undetectable unless you were watching for it. "Thank you, Owen," he said. Owen climbed down from the chair and went back to Biscuit. "Bye." Eliza spoke last. She sat in the chair and looked at Briggs and thought about the woman in the yellow apron who had said we can't take in strays, and about the man in the dry goods store who'd offered her 30 cents for her mother's quilt, and about the back of the wagon and the frozen ground and the pine stand and the promise she'd made to someone who couldn't hear her. "Tell me about your mother," Briggs said. She told him. She told him all of it, in order, the way she'd replayed it enough times that it had stopped being painful and become simply factual. The getting worse, the dying, the burial in the hard ground, the days on the road. She told it plainly, without performing the grief, because performing it would have cheapened it, and her mother didn't deserve cheap. "And your father?" Briggs said. "Left 2 years ago. We don't know where." "Do you want to find him?" She thought about it honestly. "Not particularly," she said. "He made his choice." Briggs looked at her carefully. "You're 13 years old." "I know." "You've been making decisions for 4 other people since your mother died." "Yes." "Do you think Silas Boone can be trusted with your siblings' safety?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Why?" She thought about how to say it. Not the small specific things, the fence posts and the chickens and the bowl refilled without asking, but the thing underneath all of them. "Because he was afraid of getting attached to us," she said. "You could see it. He kept saying we couldn't stay, right up until the moment he told the deputy we were staying. And the reason he was afraid is because he's lost people he loved and he didn't want to lose anyone else." She kept her eyes on Briggs. "A man who's afraid of losing people takes care of them. That's what I've seen." Briggs looked at her for a long moment. He glanced at Silas, who was looking at Eliza with the expression of a man who has heard something true said about him out loud and does not entirely know what to do with it. "Thank you," Briggs said. "You can sit down." Fletcher made a brief closing statement, citing the statutes again and repeating the pattern of violence argument with somewhat less conviction than he'd had at the start. Poole responded in his careful, methodical way. Briggs listened to both and then sat quietly for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. "I'm going to grant temporary guardianship," he said. "Mr. Boone, you'll have custody of the 5 Ashcroft children for a period of 90 days, at the end of which there will be a full review. During that period, the county retains the right to conduct welfare checks with 24 hours' notice. If those checks reveal any concern for the children's safety or well-being, the arrangement will be revisited immediately." He looked up. "This is not a permanent determination. It is a recognition that what is currently happening at your property appears to be working, and that disrupting it on the basis of speculation would not serve these children's interests." He looked at Fletcher. "I note for the record that the evidence presented by the opposing party relied heavily on hearsay and on an incident that occurred 15 years ago, for which the relevant penalty was already administered. I'll also note that the witness from Harlan's Crossing, under questioning, confirmed that the condition she described predated the children's arrival at the Boone Ranch." A pause. "Mr. Fletcher, you may tell your client that the county's land and water rights proceedings are a separate matter and will be treated as such." Fletcher's smooth expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Briggs gathered his papers. "We're done for today." He stood and walked out through the door behind his bench, and the room began to move and breathe again, and Poole turned to Silas and said something Eliza couldn't hear over the sound of Clara grabbing her arm. "Does that mean we can stay?" Clara said. "Yes," Eliza said. Her voice came out rough in a way she hadn't expected. "That means we can stay." Clara made a sound and buried her face against Eliza's shoulder, and Eliza put her arm around her and looked across the room. Silas was standing at his table. He wasn't moving. He was looking at his hat, which he'd picked up and was holding in both hands, and his face had the look of a man who has just received something he'd decided he didn't deserve and doesn't know yet where to put it. Thomas walked up beside him and stood there. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and after a moment Silas turned and looked at him. Thomas looked back. Silas put his hat on. "Come on," he said. "Let's go home." Outside on the street in front of the courthouse, the cold had not let up. Fletcher came out behind them and walked briskly toward the hotel without looking back. Nora Voss stopped beside Silas and put her hand on his arm briefly, just briefly, and said, "Well done." and then went to her horse. Poole shook hands with everyone, including Owen, who shook back with great seriousness. Then Poole went back inside, presumably to deal with paperwork, and it was just the 6 of them on the street with the wagon and the horses and the wide November sky going orange in the west. Owen put his hand in Silas's hand. It was a small hand, and Silas looked down at it, and something moved across his face that didn't have a clean name, something old coming undone at the edges, something that had been locked up for 6 years in a room at the end of a short hallway. He closed his hand around Owen's. "Biscuit's going to be happy we're coming back," Owen said. "Biscuit came with us," Jacob said. Owen looked behind him. Biscuit was sitting beside the wagon wheel, waiting. "Oh," Owen said. "That's good. He'd be lonely." Silas helped them into the wagon. He climbed up to the bench and picked up the reins and sat for a moment, looking at the road that led back west. Eliza climbed up beside him. The town of Millhaven moved around them in its ordinary afternoon way. A man crossing the street, a woman coming out of the dry goods store, a horse tied at a rail flicking its ear at the cold. Ordinary. All of it ordinary. Eliza thought that ordinary might be the most extraordinary thing she'd ever wanted. 90 days, Silas said. 90 days, she said. He clicked to the horses. The wagon moved. The ride back from Millhaven took 2 hours, and for most of it nobody said much. That wasn't unusual. They were a family, or something close enough to it now that the distinction had started to blur and families don't always need to fill silence. But this silence had a different texture than the ordinary kind. It was the silence of people who have been holding themselves very tight for a very long time and have just been given permission, tentatively, to loosen their grip a little and aren't quite sure yet how to do that without everything spilling. Clara fell asleep against Jacob's shoulder, somewhere around the halfway point. Jacob didn't move. Thomas sat at the back of the wagon with his legs hanging off the tailgate, watching the road unspool behind them, and he had the particular stillness of a boy processing something too large for words. Owen sat with Biscuit across his lap. The dog was too big for this arrangement, but had decided it was acceptable, and talked to the dog in a steady, quiet murmur that nobody else could hear. On the bench, Silas drove and Eliza sat beside him with her hands in her lap, and the cold came down around them as the light faded. 90 days, she said again. She'd said it twice already. She wasn't sure why she kept saying it. 90 days, he confirmed. What do we do with 90 days? He thought about it. Same thing we've been doing. Work. Keep the property in order. Make sure the welfare checks find everything the way it's supposed to be. He paused. And I need to talk to Poole about what the permanent process looks like. There's more paperwork for a full custody review. Documentation of the father's absence, the mother's death recorded properly with the county, that kind of thing. My mother's burial wasn't recorded, Eliza said. We buried her. There wasn't anyone official there. Poole can handle that. There's a process for it. He glanced at her. It's not going to be a problem. She nodded, looking at the road. Silas, yeah. What Owen said in there about the difference between rescuing and staying. She paused. I didn't tell him to say that. I didn't even know he'd thought about it that way. I know you didn't. Does it? She stopped, started again. Does it bother you? What he said? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer, which was a thing he did sometimes when the question was one he needed to sit with before he opened his mouth. No, he said finally. It doesn't bother me. Another pause. It surprised me. The way things that are true sometimes do. She looked at the darkening mountains to the west and thought that was probably one of the most honest things she'd ever heard anyone say. The welfare check came 11 days into the 90, which was sooner than any of them had expected, and arrived in the form of Deputy Acker, the same man who'd come to the gate 3 weeks earlier with his clipboard and his county office coat. He came alone this time, no younger man with him, and he knocked at the front door like a person who has decided to be civil about something regardless of how the last encounter went. Silas answered the door. The 2 men looked at each other for a moment. Boone, Acker said. Deputy, Silas said, I'm here for the welfare check. I know, come in. It was a Wednesday morning, which meant Thomas and Jacob were in the south pasture checking the water line that fed the cattle trough, a job Silas had assigned them because the line had been giving trouble, and he trusted Thomas's eye for where the problem was likely to be. Clara was in the kitchen making biscuits, which she'd been doing every Wednesday since the third week, because she'd discovered that she was good at it and that Silas ate too without commenting, which was his version of a compliment. Owen was outside near the barn stacking the smaller pieces of split wood into the secondary pile the way Silas had shown him, slowly and with great attention to keeping the stack straight. Acker moved through the house without ceremony, looking at things the way a person looks when they're trying to be fair about what they see. He looked at the kitchen, which was clean and functional and smelled like biscuits. He looked at the back room, which now had proper bedding on both beds, and a small shelf Thomas had built from leftover lumber and mounted on the wall for the children's few belongings. He looked at the main room, where a second chair had appeared beside the fire, purchased on the last trip to Millhaven, placed there by Silas without comment, used by Eliza most evenings. He went outside and looked at the barn and the paddock and the cattle and Owen's woodpile, which was straighter than most adult woodpiles. Then he came back to the front of the house where Silas was waiting. "Everything looks in order," Acker said. "It is in order," Silas said. Acker was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man who is trying to decide whether to say something that isn't strictly part of his job. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "I filed the Halsey complaint as what it was, a land interest using county services as a lever." He looked at Silas steadily. "I've been doing this job long enough to know the difference." Silas looked at him. "I appreciate that. Don't appreciate it too much. I'll still come back in 30 days, and I'll still report exactly what I see." He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the porch railing. "But what I'm seeing right now is a working ranch with children who are where they're supposed to be." He put his hat on. "That counts for something." He rode away, and Silas stood on the porch watching him go, and Eliza came out of the house and stood beside him. "That was better than I expected," she said. "He's a fair man," Silas said. "I should have known that earlier. I've been treating everyone from the county as the same problem. They weren't all fair. No, but more of them are than I'd given them credit for." He turned and went back inside. "We've got a water line issue in the south pasture." "I know," she said, following. "Thomas will find it." "Thomas will find it," he agreed. "I'm going to go help him look anyway." Boab. December came in hard. The kind of Montana December that doesn't apologize for itself. Sustained cold, periodic snow that meant constant work keeping the cattle accessible to water and hay, and the particular challenge of 5 children and 1 man living in close quarters through the short days. The ranch, which had felt large in November, seemed to contract in December. The house smaller, the distances between people either shorter or longer depending on the day. They developed a rhythm, the way people do when they have no choice, and the rhythm was imperfect in the specific ways that things are imperfect when real people are involved. Thomas and Silas had an argument in the second week of December about the right way to position the hay feeders in the north pasture, and it was a genuine argument, both of them certain and neither of them wrong exactly. And it ended with Silas doing it Thomas's way and it working better than his own method would have, which he acknowledged with exactly 2 words, "Good call." And Thomas spent the rest of the day visibly trying not to look too pleased about this. Jacob broke his finger in the 3rd week of December, catching it wrong between 2 fence posts, and the resulting 45 minutes. The sharp cry, the running, the assessment of the damage, the drive to get Nora Voss, who had some medical knowledge, the splinting, the sitting with Jacob while he was stoic about it, in the way boys are stoic when they're actually frightened, left everyone shaken in the quiet aftermath. It was Silas who sat with Jacob through the worst of it, who held the boy's arm steady while Nora worked, who said nothing in particular but didn't move away. Clara burned a batch of biscuits the following week and cried about it with an intensity that wasn't really about the biscuits, and Eliza let her cry and then told her to make another batch, and the second batch was fine. Owen stopped needing to sleep with the lamp on sometime in mid-December, though nobody made any announcement about this. It was just one night the lamp stayed dark, and the next morning he came to breakfast without mentioning it, and nobody else mentioned it either, and Silas opened the locked door. Eliza didn't discover this immediately. She discovered it on a Thursday afternoon when she went to the end of the short hallway to get an extra blanket from the linen shelf, a shelf she'd organized herself, In the first week, because it had been in a state that suggested someone had been taking things from it in the dark without looking. And the door was open. Not wide open. Ajar. A few inches, enough to see that there was afternoon light coming in from a window inside. She stood in the hallway for a moment, then she knocked on the doorframe. "Come in," Silas said. She pushed the door open. It was a child's room. Or it had been. It had been kept as one, carefully, through 6 years of a house where no child lived. A narrow bed with a quilt on it, the quilt faded but clean. A shelf with a few things on it. A tin cup, a worn-down pencil, a drawing that had been pinned to the wall and gone wavy with age. A small pair of boots on the floor beneath the shelf, toes facing out, as though the boy who'd owned them had just stepped out of them. Silas was sitting on the edge of the bed. He had the wooden horse, Runner, in his hands. Eliza stood in the doorway and didn't say anything for a moment. "I thought it was time," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the shelf. "The boots are going to be too small for any of them, but some of the other things—" He stopped. "I thought Owen might like the tin cup. It has a dent in it, so it's not good for anything formal, but Owen doesn't care about dents." "No," Eliza said. "He doesn't. And there's a book on the shelf that Thomas might—" He stopped again. She came in and sat beside him on the edge of the narrow bed, not close, leaving space between them, and looked at the shelf. The drawing on the wall was a horse, she could see now. Not a skilled drawing, but an enthusiastic one, with too many legs and ears that pointed in different directions. The kind of drawing that is entirely recognizable as a horse, despite being nothing like one. "He drew that," Silas said. "It's a good horse," she said. He looked at it. "It has 6 legs." "That's just more horse," she said. He made the sound, the small, reluctant one she'd learned to recognize. It came more easily now than it had in November. Not easily exactly, but with less resistance. "You don't have to do this today," she said. "The room. It doesn't have to be today. I know." He turned to Runner over in his hands, but it felt like keeping it locked was a way of keeping something else locked. "And I'm not sure that's useful anymore." She looked at the small pair of boots on the floor. "Are you sure?" "No," he said, honestly, "but I'm doing it anyway." She nodded. She understood that kind of decision. The kind you make because the alternative is staying still, and staying still has its own costs. "Can I give Owen the cup?" she asked. He looked at it on the shelf. "Yeah." "And the book to Thomas?" "Check if he'd want it first. Thomas is particular about books." "Thomas is particular about everything," she said. "He gets that from somewhere," Silas said with a sideways look that might have been, in a different man, the beginning of a joke at her expense. She stood. "I'll leave you to it. Eliza." She stopped at the door. He was still looking at the shelf. "I'm going to ask Poole what the full custody application requires. The permanent one. Not the review, the actual application." She held the doorframe. "Okay. I wanted you to know I was thinking about it. I'm not—" He stopped. "I don't want you to find out secondhand." She looked at the back of his head, the gray coming through the dark hair, the set of the shoulders that she'd learned to read over 6 weeks the way you learn to read weather. "Thank you for telling me," she said. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the stove for a moment without doing anything in particular, and then she started on dinner, and the house was quiet around her in the way that houses are quiet, when they are full of people who are each doing what they need to do. But January brought 2 things, the second welfare check and Creed Halsey. The welfare check came first, mid-January, Acker again, and it went the way the first one had. Thorough, civil, and concluding with the notation that the arrangement was continuing satisfactorily. Acker spent longer with Owen this time, which might have been concern, or might have been that Owen was simply the most interesting person on the property to talk to. Owen told him about Biscuit's ear infection, which Nora Voss had diagnosed and treated, and about the way snow looked different at different times of day, and about the 6-legged horse drawing in Henry's room, which Owen had been allowed to visit and had declared was the best horse drawing he'd ever seen. Acker wrote his report and rode away. Creed Halsey came 3 days later. He didn't send the drifter this time. He came himself, which told Eliza something about how he'd assessed the situation. that the indirect approach hadn't worked, and he decided to try a different kind of pressure. He was a thick-set man of perhaps 55, well-fed, with the prosperous and untroubled air of someone who has gotten what he wanted often enough to expect it as a matter of course. He came to the front gate in a good coat and a good hat, and two men behind him on horses, and he stood at the gate and called for Silas in the tone of a man accustomed to people coming to him. Silas went to the gate alone. Eliza watched from the porch, close enough to hear if the wind cooperated, which it did. "Mr. Boone," Halsey said, "I think it's past time we spoke directly." "We can speak," Silas said. He didn't open the gate. "My interest is the water rights on your eastern creek. I think you know that." "I know it. I've made what I consider to be a fair offer twice now through my representative. You've declined." Halsey looked at the property, the barn, the house, the fence lines Thomas and Jacob and Silas had spent weeks repairing. "I understand you have a custody situation in progress." "I do. That kind of proceeding can go in several directions," Halsey said pleasantly. "A man with complications in his personal and legal life sometimes finds that county processes become slower, more scrutinized." Silas looked at him. "Are you telling me you have influence over a county custody proceeding?" "I'm telling you that I'm a man with considerable investment in this county, and that people listen to me." He spread his hands. "I'm not making a threat, Mr. Boone. I'm describing reality." "Your reality," Silas said. "The county's reality. These things are related." Halsey smiled. "Sell me the water rights. I'll pay fair market rate plus 20%, and I'll make no further inquiries into your living arrangements." Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked at Halsey, and then at the two men behind him, and then back at Halsey. "Mr. Halsey," he said, "I'm going to say this once. The water rights aren't for sale. The Eastern Creek feeds cattle on this property that 5 children depend on for their livelihood, and I'm not going to sell the thing those cattle need to survive in order to make your map cleaner." He paused. "And if you attempt to use influence, your word, over a county custody proceeding, I'm going to bring that to Judge Briggs's attention directly, along with your man Fletcher's involvement in the first hearing, and let Briggs decide what it amounts to." Bots. Halsey's pleasant expression held, but something behind it shifted. "You're making an enemy." "I've had enemies," Silas said. "They've done about as well as you'd expect." He turned from the gate. "Don't come back to this property." He walked back toward the house. He passed Eliza on the porch without stopping, went inside, and she heard the particular way the door closed. Not slammed, but definitive. The sound of a man who has said the last word and means it. Eliza turned from the retreating figures of Halsey and his men and followed Silas inside. He was at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood, looking at nothing. "He's going to try something else," she said. "Probably." "Do we tell Poole?" "Today," he said. "I'll ride to Millhaven today." He looked up. "It's all right, Eliza. This is manageable." "I know it's manageable," she said. "I'm not panicking." "I know you're not." She sat down across from him. "What I want to know is how you did that." He looked at her. "Did what?" "Talk to him like that. Without... You didn't raise your voice. You didn't look scared." He thought about it. "I was scared," he said. "Not of him. Of what he could do to the review." He turned his hands over on the table, palms up, a gesture she'd never seen from him before, more open than his usual bearing. "But I've spent 15 years being afraid of what I might do when I'm angry. At some point, you get tired of managing the fear, and you just say what's true and let it be what it is." She looked at his hands. "That sounds like something you learned the hard way." "Most things I know, I learned the hard way," he said. "I'm not particularly fast." She looked at him across the table, this man who had held a rifle at children and then fed them dinner, who had unlocked a door because staying still had its own costs, who had said, "I promise" to a 5-year-old and meant every syllable of it. "You're fast enough," she said. Poole filed a formal complaint against Halsey's interference with county proceedings within the week, supported by a written account from Silas, and, independently, a note from Acker confirming that the first welfare check had been preceded by pressure from a party with a known financial interest in the Boone property. It wasn't a criminal matter, Poole said. Not enough for that. But it went into the record, and the record was what Briggs would have in front of him at the final review. February came. The days got fractionally longer, which was mostly symbolic but mattered anyway. Thomas turned 12, which Eliza marked by making the chocolate cake their mother had made every birthday. From memory, slightly wrong in the proportions but recognizable enough. Silas gave Thomas a good pocket knife, used but oiled and sharp, with a bone handle. And Thomas said thank you with the contained but visible feeling of a boy who understands he's been seen. Jacob's finger healed. Owen grew half an inch that anyone could measure. Clara read her way through 2 of the books Nora Voss had lent her and returned them with a written note, because Clara believed in thank you notes, and Nora had written back, because apparently Nora did too. And Silas sat down with Poole and filed the application for permanent guardianship. He told Eliza the same evening, at the kitchen table after the children were asleep, the way he'd taken to telling her things, quietly, directly, without preamble. "It's filed," he said. She looked at him. "When's the review?" "Poole says 6 weeks, give or take." Briggs sets the date. 6 weeks. She did the math without meaning to. They'd been on the ranch for nearly 3 months. The 90 days of temporary guardianship were almost up, which meant the review was timed almost exactly right. "How do you feel about it?" she asked. He considered this with the honesty he'd been applying to things more often lately. "Like a man who wants something he's not sure he deserves," he said. "You've been taking care of us for 3 months." "I know. You fixed the fence and taught Thomas about post depth and sat with Jacob when his finger was broken, and you opened Henry's room so Owen could have a tin cup with a dent in it." She kept her voice even. "What part of that is not deserving?" He was quiet. "You can say you're scared," she said. "You're allowed to be scared." "I know I'm allowed," he said, with a slight edge that told her she was close to something he didn't entirely want pressed. She pulled back. "Okay." He turned his cup on the table. "I'm scared," he said. "There. It's said." "Okay," she said again quietly. "If Briggs says no, I don't know what I—" He stopped. "I don't know what I do with that." She looked at him. "Then let's make sure Briggs says yes." "How?" "Same way we've been doing it." She stood and picked up her cup. "We just keep being what we are." He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up at her. "What are we?" She thought about the question. She thought about the wagon and the frozen ground and the rifle and the pot of beans and the locked door and the 6-legged horse and the tin cup with the dent and the 12-year-old with a pocket knife and the promise she'd made to someone who couldn't hear her and the way it had, somehow, in 3 months, become something she'd never had a word for before. "A family," she said. "I think we're a family." He didn't say anything. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the fire ticked in the stove, and the house held them in its walls, and outside the February dark was enormous and cold and entirely indifferent to all of it. "Go to sleep, Eliza," he said. His voice was the same as it always was. Mostly. "Good night," she said, and went to bed. The review was scheduled for the 2nd week of March. By the time the date arrived, the snow had started its slow retreat from the southern slopes. Not spring yet, but the first suggestions of it. A quality to the afternoon light that hadn't been there in January. A smell in the mud near the creek that meant the ground was starting to give. The children knew about the review. Silas had told them directly, without softening it, because Eliza had told him early on that they'd rather know hard things plainly than have them managed. And he'd believed her. They responded in their characteristic ways. Thomas went quiet and worked harder, which was his method for dealing with uncertainty. Jacob asked a series of precise questions about what specifically would happen at the review and what the possible outcomes were, and received precise answers, and appeared somewhat comforted by the precision itself. Clara cried once, briefly, at the kitchen table, and then got up and made biscuits and didn't cry again. Owen asked Silas if Biscuit would be allowed to come to Mill Haven. "Probably not inside the courthouse," Silas said. "Can he wait outside?" "He can wait outside." "Okay," Owen said, apparently resolved. The night before the review, Eliza was in the main room with the lamp low, going over in her head what she was going to say, when she heard a sound from Henry's room, which was what they'd started calling it, Henry's room, without anyone deciding to, the way names settle on things when nobody's looking. She went to the doorway. Owen was sitting on Henry's bed in the dark with Runner, the carved wooden horse, in his hands. He'd climbed out of his bed in the children's room and come here, which he did sometimes, and Silas had said nothing about it, which was its own kind of statement. "You should be asleep," Eliza said. "I know," Owen said. "I was thinking." She came in and sat beside him on the narrow bed. "About what?" "About what happens if the judge says no." She looked at her brother, 5.5 years old, with his mother's nose and his father's stubbornness and a quality entirely his own that she didn't have a name for, a kind of clarity, like water that hasn't been muddied yet. "What do you think happens?" she said, because she wanted to know what was in his head. "I think Silas said he'd find another way," Owen said. "He promised." "He did, and Silas doesn't break promises." It was stated as fact, established by evidence, the way Owen stated most things. "No," she said, "he doesn't." Owen turned Runner over in his hands. "Eliza, is Silas our dad?" She was quiet for a moment. It was the first time any of them had said it out loud, that specific word, and it hung in the air of the small room with its faded quilt and its 6-legged horse drawing and its small pair of boots. "What do you think?" she said. Owen thought about it seriously. "I think he acts like one," he said. "I don't remember what our real dad acted like very much, but I think this is what it's supposed to feel like." She put her arm around him. He leaned into her. "I think you might be right," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Can I keep Runner, just for tonight?" She looked at the small carved horse. "You'd have to ask Silas. He said I could hold it whenever I wanted." She looked at her brother. "Then yes," she said, "you can keep it tonight." She took him back to his bed and tucked him in and went back to the main room, where the lamp was low and the fire was banked for the night, and she sat in the chair beside the fire, the second chair, the one Silas had bought without comment and placed without ceremony, and she let herself feel, for a few minutes, everything she'd been holding at a functional distance for 3 months. The missing her mother, the relief that was still too fragile to trust entirely, the fear about tomorrow, the things she hadn't said out loud yet, that Owen had said plainly without hesitation because he was 5 and didn't know yet that some things were complicated. "Is Silas our dad?" She sat with that for a while. Then she banked the fire properly and went to bed, because tomorrow required her rested, and she had long since learned to give herself what she needed before she could give anything to anyone else. In the morning, Silas was already up when she came to the kitchen. He'd made coffee, and there was cornbread on the back of the stove, and he was standing at the window looking at the yard where the first thin light was coming up gray and cold. He heard her and turned. "Ready?" he said. She looked at him. The gray in his hair, the set of the shoulders, the dark eyes that had been flat and worn down when she'd first seen them and were something different now. Not healed, exactly, because some things don't heal, they just become part of what you carry. But different. "Yes," she said. He poured her coffee. "Owen wants to know if Biscuit can wait outside," she said. "I already told him he could," Silas said. She looked at her coffee. "He had Runner last night." A pause. "I know. I checked on them." He looked back at the window. He'd put it on the pillow next to his head. She didn't say anything to that. "Come on," he said after a moment. "Let's get the others up." She took her coffee and went to wake her brothers and sister, and in the growing light of a March morning in Montana, the ranch held itself together around them. The fence lines Thomas had helped fix, the barn Jacob had helped muck, the chickens Claire attended, the woodpile Owen kept straight, and it was not perfect, not smooth, not anything other than what it actually was, which was, she thought, exactly enough. The road to Millhaven was familiar now in a way it hadn't been in November. Eliza noticed this from the wagon bench, the bend where the pines thinned and the valley opened up, the particular rock formation on the eastern ridge that looked like a dropped hat, the place where the road dipped and collected water and you had to take it at an angle or the left wheel sank. She knew this road. 3 months ago, she hadn't known any road in Montana. Now she knew this one well enough to anticipate its problems, which was, she thought, about as good a measure of belonging as any. The children were quieter than usual. Not frightened exactly, something more complicated than that, the particular tension of people who want something badly enough that wanting it has become almost physical. Thomas sat straight on the bench beside her, which was what he did when he was managing something internally. Jacob had both hands on the wagon's side rail, and was watching the road with the focused attention of someone who needs to be looking at something concrete. Clara had dressed carefully that morning in the better of her two dresses, and had braided her hair with a neatness that suggested she'd been awake for some time before anyone else stirred. Owen had Runner in his coat pocket. He'd asked Silas that morning if he could bring it, and Silas had said yes without hesitation, and Owen had put it in his pocket and patted it once to make sure it was there, and that had been that. Biscuit rode in the wagon bed, having once again decided that today was a traveling day. Silas drove. He'd said almost nothing since they left the ranch, which was within the normal range for him, but had a different quality this morning, more compressed, like something under pressure. He held the reins with the same practiced ease he always did, but his jaw was set in the way it got when he was working through something he couldn't resolve by thinking harder. Eliza watched him for a moment from the corner of her eye. Then she looked at the road. "It's going to be all right," she said, quietly, so only he could hear. He didn't answer immediately. Then, "You keep saying that, because it keeps being true." He made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite dismissal, somewhere in between, and they rode the rest of the way to Millhaven without saying much more. Garrett Poole was waiting outside the courthouse again, in the same spot, as though he'd been there continuously since November and simply hadn't moved. He shook Silas's hand, looked at the children with the quick assessing nod that was his version of warmth, and said, "Nora's already inside. Acker submitted his reports. Both of them. Briggs has had the full record for a week." "And?" Silas said. "And Briggs doesn't telegraph his decisions," Poole said, "which you already know." He glanced at the children. "They holding up?" "They're fine," Eliza said, which was close enough to true. "Fletcher's not here," Poole added. "Halsey didn't send representation. After the complaint Acker filed, I don't think he wanted his name anywhere near this proceeding." Silas's expression shifted fractionally. "That's something. It's more than something. It means the only voices in that room today are the ones speaking for you." Poole straightened his coat. "Let's go in." Owen tied Biscuit's lead to the post outside with the careful knot Silas had taught him, a real knot, not a child's approximation, and patted the dog once on the head. "We'll be back," he said to Biscuit, with the gravity of someone making a commitment. Biscuit sat down and prepared to wait, which was something he was good at. Well, the courtroom looked the same as it had in November. Same pine resin smell, same inadequate stove, same wooden partition separating it from the county recorder's office. But it felt different, and the difference was that now Eliza recognized the room. Last time she'd walked in as a stranger, trying to hold herself together in front of people who were deciding her life. This time she walked in knowing where the chairs were, knowing the acoustics, knowing that the bench where Briggs sat had a scratch on the left corner from something that had happened before any of them arrived. Familiarity wasn't comfort, exactly, but it was something. Nora Voss was already seated along the wall, her back straight, her hands in her lap. She looked at them as they came in and gave a brief nod. The Nora Voss version of reassurance, which was to say it was spare and entirely genuine. Briggs came in at 9 o'clock exactly, sat down, and looked at the assembled room with the same careful attention he'd used in November. "This is the permanent guardianship review for the Ashcroft children," he said, "currently in the temporary custody of Silas Boone. I've reviewed the full record, including both welfare check reports from Deputy Acker, the complaint filed in January regarding outside interference with county proceedings, and the original testimony from the November hearing." He looked at the papers in front of him. "I'd like to begin with Mr. Boone and then hear from Mrs. Voss, and then from each of the children. Mr. Poole, you're welcome to speak at the end." Silas stood. He was less stiff than he'd been in November. Not smooth. Silas was never going to be smooth in a courtroom, and Eliza had come to think this was one of the more trustworthy things about him, but less like a man bracing for impact. He told Briggs about the 90 days directly and specifically. The fence work completed, the water line repaired, Jacob's broken finger and how it had been handled, Thomas's birthday, the welfare checks, and what Acker had found at each one. He talked about Halsey's visit to the gate in January, what Halsey had said and what Silas had said back, without dramatizing either side. He told Briggs about filing the application for permanent guardianship and why. Then Briggs said, "Tell me what's changed for you since November." Silas was quiet for a moment. The question was a different kind than the practical ones, and they both knew it. In November, Silas said, I told myself I was doing a temporary thing, that I was helping because there was nobody else, and that was a practical problem requiring a practical solution. He paused. By December, I knew that wasn't what it was, but I didn't have a better word for it yet. And now? Briggs said. Silas looked at the table in front of him. Now I have 5 people I'd do anything to keep safe. That's not a practical problem. That's just what it is. He looked up at Briggs. I don't know if that's the kind of answer you're looking for. It's an answer, Briggs said. Sit down. Norvos stood and gave her account with the same measured precision she'd used in November, but with 3 months of additional evidence behind it. She described her visit to the ranch in December, which nobody had known about except Silas, who had apparently mentioned it to Poole. She described what she'd seen. A barn that was functioning, cattle in good winter condition, children who were occupied and fed, and who talked about the ranch the way people talk about places they belong to. She described Clara's thank you note, which she produced from her coat pocket and read aloud, a paragraph in Clara's careful handwriting about the books and what she'd learned from them and what she hoped to read next. And she said, without ornamentation, that is not the letter of a child who is suffering. She sat down. Briggs looked at the children along the wall. Thomas stood. He was taller than he'd been in November, so a quarter inch maybe, not much, but visible. He walked to the witness chair and sat in it without fidgeting. Tell me about the past 3 months, Briggs said. Thomas told him. He was specific, as he always was. The things he'd learned about fence work, about cattle management, about reading weather, by the way, the wind moved through the north pasture. He told Briggs about the argument he'd had with Silas about the hay feeders, and how Silas had done it Thomas's way, and how that had been— He paused, looking for the right word. Unexpected? Briggs offered. I was going to say fair, Thomas said. I've had adults tell me I was wrong about things I wasn't wrong about, because I was the kid and they were the adult. He didn't do that. Briggs nodded. Is there anything you want to tell me that I haven't asked about? Thomas thought about it. I want to stay, he said. Not because I have to, because I want to. There's a difference. There is, Briggs agreed. Thank you. Jacob told Briggs about his broken finger in the same sequential and specific way he'd described things in November, but the story had changed shape in the retelling. In November, he might have described it as an injury that had been dealt with. What he described now was something more than that. He described Silas's hands holding his arm steady, and the way Silas hadn't told him not to cry, but hadn't made anything of it when he did, and the sitting with him after. And he said, I've been hurt before and nobody sat with me after. He said it plainly, without self-pity, as a comparative observation. He did. Clara stood and walked to the chair and said, before Briggs could ask anything, I know you're going to ask me if I feel safe. I do, but I want to say something else, if that's all right. Briggs gestured for her to continue. I feel like myself there, she said. I haven't felt like myself in a long time, since before our mother got sick even. Like there was a version of me that was just waiting to be somewhere long enough to come back. She looked at her hands in her lap. That's what the ranch did. It was long enough, and now I'm back. She looked up. I want to stay. Then Owen walked to the chair. He climbed up onto it the same way he had in November, legs not reaching the floor, and looked at Briggs with the direct and uncomplicated attention of a child who has not yet learned to perform for authority. Owen, Briggs said, it's good to see you again. You too, Owen said politely. Can you tell me how things have been at the ranch? Owen thought about this. Biscuit's ear is better, he said. He had an infection. Mrs. Voss fixed it. He patted his coat pocket where Runner was. And Thomas turned 12. We had cake. Eliza made it a little wrong, but it still tasted good. From the wall, Eliza saw Clara press her mouth together to keep something in. Are you happy there? Briggs asked. Owen considered the word with the seriousness he gave most things. I think so, he said. I wasn't happy for a long time. After Mama. He said this without breaking, which was the most heartbreaking part, the flatness of it, the way grief becomes ordinary when you're 5 and it's been long enough. But now I mostly am. What made the difference? Briggs said. Owen put his hand in his coat pocket and held Runner without taking it out. Silas didn't leave, he said. That's the thing about Silas. He doesn't leave. He looked at Briggs steadily. Other people left. Our dad left. Mama didn't want to leave, but she had to. Every place we went after that, we knew we were going to have to leave again. He paused. But Silas didn't leave. And we didn't have to leave either. And after a while, that starts to feel like something. The room was very quiet. Briggs looked at the boy for a long moment. Owen, he said. Is Silas your family? Owen didn't hesitate. Yes, he said. He's our dad. He didn't used to be, but he is now. Briggs wrote something in his papers, slowly. Then he looked at Eliza. Miss Ashcroft. Chunt. She walked to the chair and sat down and looked at Briggs, and she thought about everything she could say. The 3 months of work and cold and arguments and broken fingers and burned biscuits and birthday cake made wrong. The locked door that had been opened. The second chair by the fire. The promise she'd made to her mother in a pine stand outside a town she still couldn't name, and the way that promise had led her, by a road she never could have predicted, to this room, this chair, this moment. She thought about what she'd told Briggs in November, that a man afraid of losing people takes care of them. She still believed that. But 3 months had added something to it, layered it the way sediment layers, until the thing she'd said then was still true, but thinner than the truth she had now. Miss Ashcroft, Briggs said, is there anything you want to add to what your siblings have said? Yes, she said. He waited. I want to say something about what I've learned, she said. Not about Silas specifically, about what I thought family was before and what I think it is now. She paused. I used to think family was the people you started with, your mother, your father, your brothers and sisters. People you were assigned to before you were old enough to have an opinion about it. And when those people leave, when they die or walk away or just stop showing up, you lose the family and you're done. That's what I thought. Mom, wotim swasam. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at Briggs. What I know now is that family is something you build, not plan. You can't plan it because you don't get to choose the circumstances. But you can choose what you do inside the circumstances. Silas didn't plan any of this. He pointed a rifle at us, and then he fed us dinner, and then a 5-year-old asked him a question, and he couldn't walk away from it. None of that was planned. Bam Boshicham's son. She paused. But every day after that first day, he chose to stay. Every day he woke up and decided again. That's not something that gets assigned. That's something you do. Bad ist so sieht. She looked at Silas at his table. He was looking back at her, and his face had the quality she'd come to know, the compressed, careful quality of a man feeling more than he wants to show, managing it with the same deliberate effort he put into everything. He's my family, she said. He's all of ours. Not because he has to be, because he kept choosing to be, and so did we. And at some point, choosing something every day is the same as it being true. She stood. That's what I wanted to say. She went back to her seat. Briggs reviewed his papers for a moment that felt much longer than it was. The pot-bellied stove ticked. Outside, muffled by the courthouse walls, Millhaven went about its ordinary morning. Then Briggs set his papers down. I've been handling custody matters in this county for 16 years, he said. In that time, I've seen arrangements that looked correct on paper and were disasters in practice. And I've seen arrangements that looked unlikely and became the most stable thing in a child's life. He looked at the papers, then at the room. This proceeding is not about what looks correct on paper. It's about what is actually true. He paused. What is actually true is that these 5 children arrived in this county in November in circumstances of genuine hardship, and that in the subsequent months they have been housed, fed, educated in practical skills, and cared for by a man with no legal obligation to do any of that. What is also true is that an outside party attempted to use this proceeding as leverage in a land dispute, and that attempt was documented and refuted. And what is true beyond either of those things is what I observed in November and what I've heard confirmed today, that these children are not in a place that merely meets minimum standards. They are in a place where they are known. He looked at Silas. Mr. Boone, I am granting permanent guardianship of the 5 Ashcroft minors, Eliza, Thomas, Jacob, Clara, and Owen, to you, effective immediately. This determination will be reviewed at the children's majority or upon material change in circumstances. He set his pen down. We're done. He stood and walked out the way he'd come, unhurried, as though he hadn't just changed 6 people's lives with a paragraph. The room came back to life slowly, the way it does after something significant. Poole shaking Silas's hand, Nora crossing to the children, the general movement of bodies that had been held very still releasing themselves. Eliza didn't move immediately. She sat in her chair and let it land. The actual weight of it, the permanence that 90 days of temporary had only approximated. Permanent. The word sat in her chest like something warm and slightly too large, the way good things sometimes feel when you've spent long enough not having them. Clara was crying, which she'd probably been holding back since Briggs started his final statement. Thomas had both hands on the back of the chair in front of him and was looking at the floor with the expression of a boy who is not going to cry in a courthouse and is winning the fight so far. Jacob had crossed the room to Silas and was standing next to him the way he'd stood next to him at the fence line. No particular reason, just next to him. Owen walked across the room, took Runner out of his coat pocket, and held it up to Silas. Silas looked down at him. This should stay at the ranch, Owen said. I think Henry would want it to stay at the ranch, since we live there now. Silas crouched down, knees creaking, same as always, and looked at the small carved horse in Owen's hand. You can keep it, he said. Henry wouldn't mind you having it. Owen shook his head. It should be on the shelf, he said, with the certainty of a child who has thought about this and arrived at a conclusion. Where it always was, that's where it belongs. He pressed it into Silas's hand. And we can look at it whenever we want. Silas's hand closed around the horse. He stayed crouched for a moment at Owen's eye level, and whatever he was feeling in that moment he didn't try to name, and the boy didn't ask him to. Then Silas stood up and put Runner in his coat pocket, and the 5 of them went out into the March morning where Biscuit was waiting at his post with the patience of a dog who was told to wait and took that seriously. On the road home, the silence was different from the mornings. The morning had been the silence of people bracing. This was the silence of people who have set something down. A weight carried so long the body doesn't know immediately what to do without it, still feels the ghost of it, needs time to adjust to the new distribution. Eliza felt it. She thought they all did, in their various ways. Somewhere past the halfway point, Thomas said, without looking at anyone in particular, the north fence line's going to need checking before April. The ground's going to shift when it thaws, and some of those posts we set in December might need resetting. Silas was quiet for a moment. That's probably right. I can start on the south end. Jacob can do the east. You'll need to check the post depth first, Silas said. Don't assume they held just because they looked right when we set them. I know, Thomas said. You told me that. I'm telling you again. I heard you the first time, Thomas said in the tone of a 12-year-old who respects someone enough to push back on them, which is its own form of trust. Silas made a sound, not quite a laugh, something adjacent, and they rode on. Owen fell asleep against Clara's arm in the wagon bed, runnerless and apparently unbothered by this, one hand still resting in Biscuit's fur. Clara looked out at the landscape moving past, the retreating snow on the slopes, the bare aspens beginning their first tentative suggestion of color. Jacob had his eyes closed, not sleeping, just resting, which was a thing he'd started doing in the past few weeks, allowing himself to be still without filling the stillness with something useful. Eliza looked at the road ahead. She thought about her mother, the way she often did on roads. Catherine Ashcroft, who had made her promise, who had not known when she made her daughter promise that the promise would lead here, that here would even be possible. Promises made to dying people are acts of love without information. You don't know what keeping them will cost or where they'll take you. You make them because refusing is unthinkable, and then you live inside them for as long as it takes. She had kept the promise. They were not separated. They were more together, in fact, than they'd been in years. Not just the 5 of them, but 6 now, bound by something that didn't have a clean name, something built from fence posts and biscuits and broken fingers, and a carved horse on a shelf and a second chair by the fire, and 90 days of choosing and then one more day and then another. That was how it worked, she thought. Not a single moment of rescue, just the choosing, repeated, until the choosing becomes the shape of a life. The ranch appeared around the last bend the way it always did. Low house, weathered barn, fence lines that were tighter now than they'd been in November. The creek visible through the east pasture trees, its sound carrying faint on the March air. The cattle in the north field, solid and unconcerned. Silas pulled the wagon into the yard and the horses stopped with the relief of animals who know their home. For a moment nobody moved. Then Owen woke up, looked around, and said, "We're back," with the simple satisfaction of someone who expected to return and has been confirmed in this expectation. "We're back," Eliza said. They climbed down, Biscuit jumping first, as always, landing with the slightly undignified scramble of an old dog who refuses to acknowledge his age. Clara went directly to the chicken coop to check on her birds, because she'd been gone since morning and felt the absence. Jacob went to the barn. Thomas picked up the post-hole digger from where it was leaning against the fence and carried it to the barn, because he'd already been thinking about the thaw. Silas unhitched the horses and led them to the paddock, moving through the routine the way he moved through every routine, efficiently, without performance, the work of a man who finds steadiness in the repetition of necessary things. Eliza stood in the yard and watched the ranch resume itself around her. This was the part nobody told you about, she thought. The stories you hear about people finding homes, finding families, they end at the finding. They don't tell you about the afternoon after, the ordinary resumption, the way the chickens still need to be checked, and the horses still need to be unhitched, and the fence posts will still shift in the thaw regardless of what a judge said that morning. They don't tell you that the ordinary is the point, that what you were actually fighting for the whole time was the right to come home to a place where nothing extraordinary is happening. Just a boy checking fence posts and a girl counting chickens and a man putting horses in a paddock and a 5-year-old telling a dog about his day. Silas came back from the paddock and stopped beside her. He stood with his hands at his sides, looking at the house. "It needs new siding on the west wall," he said, "before next winter." "I know," she said. "We can do that in summer." He looked at her sideways. "You already thought about it." "I think about a lot of things," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You know you don't have to manage all of it anymore. That's what—" He stopped. "That's what having someone else around is for." She looked at him. He was still looking at the house, not at her, which she'd learned was sometimes how he said the things that were hardest to say. "I know," she said. "Do you?" She considered it honestly. "I'm working on it," she said, which was more accurate. He nodded, accepting the distinction. He reached into his coat pocket and took out Runner, the small carved horse, and looked at it for a moment. "I'm going to put it back on the shelf," he said. "Owen's right. It belongs there." "It does," she said. He went inside. She stayed in the yard for a moment longer, in the March cold that was already slightly less than it had been. The difference between February cold and March cold being one of those things that's subtle and entirely real, a fraction of degree, a quality of light, the ground's first memory of warmth. From inside the house she heard Owen's voice, and then Silas's, and then the particular sound of a shelf item being set down carefully, put back in its place. She stayed in the yard until she'd finished feeling everything she needed to feel, which was a skill she was still developing. The ability to let something be as large as it actually was before folding it back to workable size. Her mother had been good at that. She was learning. Then she went inside. The kitchen was warm. The fire needed building up, which she did. Owen was already at the table telling Silas something about the clouds he'd seen on the road, which he said looked like the 6-legged horse drawing, which he said was the best shape for clouds. Silas was listening with the expression she'd come to know as his listening expression. Not demonstrative, not warm in any obvious way, but absolutely present. She put water on for coffee. Thomas came in from the barn and went straight to the sink. Clara came in behind him, reported 2 new eggs, and began telling Jacob, who hadn't asked, about which hen had laid them and how she knew. The house filled up with the sound of them. Silas looked across the kitchen at Eliza, brief. The way you look at someone when you don't need to say the thing you're looking at them about because you both already know what it is. She looked back. Then she turned to the stove, because the water was ready, and there was dinner to start, and the north fence line needed checking before April, and Owen needed a heavier coat for next winter, and they had time, actual time, not borrowed, not temporary, to do all of it. That was the thing about choosing the same thing every day, she thought. Eventually, you stop calling it a choice. Eventually, it just becomes your life. And your life, imperfect and unfinished and full of fence posts that shift in the thaw, is everything.